The chain snapped before Nash Calloway ever touched it. He had his bolt cutters raised, jaw set, ready to bite through 40 years of rust, and the padlock simply fell apart in his hand, flakes of orange dust sifting between his fingers like the metal had been waiting all this time just to stop holding on. Behind the door in the dark, something exhaled. He told himself it was wind finding a gap in the roof. He did not believe himself even a little. That morning, he had been standing in a gravel lot behind the county annex with 11 other people, none of whom wanted what he wanted. The auctioneer, a heavyset man named Purnell who ran cattle auctions on weekdays and tax lien sales on the second Tuesday of the month, had gone through 6 parcels already. A burned-out laundromat, 2 mobile homes, a strip of desert nobody could get a well permit for, and now he was reading off the 7th in the flat, bored voice of a man who already knew how this one would go. Lot 12, Hangar C, Draper Field. County-owned since 1974, structurally condemned, environmental hold, sold as is, no inspections, no warranty, no refunds. Anybody wants to take on that headache. Opening bid is $10. Nobody laughed exactly. It was more of a collective shift, boots scraping gravel, the particular silence of people who all knew the same story and didn't care to repeat it out loud. Draper Field had been a training airstrip during the war, decommissioned so long ago that even the Historical Society had stopped bothering with the plaque. 3 families had tried to develop the old depot land since. None of the ventures had gone well. A backhoe operator broke both legs in a fall that later couldn't be explained by the ground he'd been standing on. A survey crew's equipment failed so completely, all at once, that the company that owned it wrote the whole set off as a loss rather than have it looked at. People in town didn't call it cursed. They called it Draper's luck, said it like a shrug, and steered their trucks around the turnoff out of habit more than fear. Nash raised his hand and said, 10. Purnell looked at him the way you'd look at a man ordering the expired special. Sold, he said, already reaching for the next folder, to Calloway's Repair, for $10, God help you. That was the whole transaction. $10 and a signature, for 11 acres of scrub and a hangar the county would rather forget it owned. Nash's bank account had $400 and change in it, and a letter from the bank itself sitting unopened on the workbench back at the shop, and he told himself the only thing he wanted out of Hangar C was scrap, aluminum skin, copper wire, anything with weight that a salvage yard 2 towns over would pay cash for by the pound. His father had run Calloway's Repair for 31 years without ever once needing a miracle, and Nash had exactly 6 weeks before the shop needed one badly. So he drove out that same afternoon, alone, because there wasn't anyone else to bring, and he stood at the hangar's east door with bolt cutters he didn't end up needing, and he pushed the door open on a room the size of a church. The light came in behind him in one long gray shaft and did almost nothing to the dark ahead. Dust hung so thick in the beam that it looked solid, something you could lean a ladder against. The smell reached him before his eyes adjusted, not the mildew and motor oil smell he'd braced for, but something drier, colder, faintly metallic, like a coin held too long against the tongue. He found his flashlight in his jacket pocket and clicked it on, and the beam went out across a floor swept oddly clean of the debris he'd expect after 50 years of nobody caring, and came to rest on a wall of hull that was not, could not possibly be, any aircraft his grandfather's Air Corps had ever flown. It rose past where the flashlight beam gave out, a curve of dark material that didn't have rivets so much as seams, fine as hairline cracks, running in patterns that looked deliberate the way a circuit board looks deliberate, not decoration, not accident, function he didn't have the vocabulary for. No rust. That was the detail that snagged at him and wouldn't let go. 50 years minimum sealed in a leaking building in a place that saw 110-degree summers and hard winter frost, and the surface in front of him was as smooth and unmarked as the day it had been made, whenever that day was. He put his palm flat against it out of the same instinct that makes a man touch a museum rope even though he knows better. The metal was warm. He pulled his hand back fast enough that his shoulder wrenched, heart going hard in his chest, and stood there breathing while the dust settled slow around him. Warm metal in a cold, dead building. He told himself pipes, some leftover heating system, sun-baked roof metal conducting down through a support beam, anything ordinary. None of it fit. There was no roof metal within 30 feet of where he was standing, and the building had no power, and hadn't for longer than he'd been alive. His ring caught the flashlight beam when he lifted his hand again to look at his palm, an old, plain iron band, scuffed dull, that he wore because it had been his father's and his father's father's, and nobody, in 3 generations of Callaway men, had ever thought to ask why they kept it instead of selling it for the metal, small as it was. He'd worn it so long he mostly forgot it was there. He wasn't wearing it out of sentiment so much as habit, same as the boots, same as the same drive to work every morning of his life. The wall in front of him lit up. Not the whole thing, one seam, no wider than his thumb, running vertical about chest height, flickered once, a pale cyan thread of light stitching itself into visibility and then holding, faint but real, steady as a pilot light. Nash went dead still. He did not breathe. The light did not move, did not brighten, did not do anything except exist where a moment before there had been nothing but dark, dead alloy, and he understood, with the particular cold clarity that comes right before real fear, that it had lit up because of him, because he'd stepped close enough, because of the ring or his hand or something about him standing in that specific spot that the wall had been waiting 50 years to notice. "Okay," he said out loud to nobody, because the sound of his own voice was better than the silence that came after it. "Okay." He backed up 3 steps. The thread of light stayed lit, patient, tracking nothing, doing nothing, just waiting the way a porch light waits for you to come home. He swept the flashlight along the rest of the wall and found more seams like it, dozens, dark and cold and unresponsive, and understood that only the one had answered him specifically, which was somehow worse than if the whole wall had lit at once. A single eye opening in a dark room to look at exactly him. He should have left then. He knew it even as he didn't do it, the way you know the coffee's too hot and drink it anyway. He walked the perimeter instead, flashlight beam climbing higher, and the shape of the thing started to resolve out of the dark the longer he stood there letting his eyes adjust. Not a plane, not a blimp Hangar's usual guest, but something with a prow, an honest-to-God prow, curved and knife-flat, rising up out of a floor pooled with 50 years of undisturbed dust toward a ceiling that had been built. He now understood with a lurch in his stomach, specifically to hold it. The county records had called Hangar C a storage building. Nobody had built a building this size, with a roof this reinforced, to store surplus jeeps. It was a ship, not a boat, something that had never touched water and had clearly never needed to. He found the wall panel an hour before dusk drove him out, a section of the floor near the ship's stern, where the concrete had buckled just enough to expose a rusted metal box wedged into the gap beneath, old enough that the county building had probably been poured around it rather than over it. He worked it loose with a tire iron and a lot of language his mother wouldn't have liked, and inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff as bark, he found a toolbox that wasn't his, and a notebook with a name written on the inside cover in handwriting he half recognized from an old photograph on his uncle's mantel. Emery Callaway, it said. 1943. Nash sat back on his heels in the dust and the dying light and read the first line of his great-grandfather's handwriting, and somewhere behind him, deep in the ship's black hull, something that was not wind and had never been wind made a low sound like a held breath finally being let go. He didn't read past the first page that night. His hands weren't steady enough. He put the notebook in his jacket, closed the toolbox, and walked back out through the east door into a sunset the color of a struck match, and the whole way to his truck the back of his neck prickled with the specific, unshakable certainty of being watched by something that had no eyes he could see and had decided, for now, only to watch. He didn't sleep that night so much as lie in the dark running numbers that had nothing to do with money. $10, 50 years, a ring he'd never once taken off, a wall that had looked at him and known him on sight. By the time the sun came up, he had already decided he was going back. Gus Calloway lived 4 miles out on the old county road, in a house he'd built himself the year Nash's father was born, and he answered the door in his undershirt with a coffee mug in one hand, and a look on his face that told Nash he already knew where his nephew had spent the previous afternoon. "You bought it," Gus said, "not a question." $10, Nash said. "Figured I could strip the aluminum, cover the banknote, be done with it by Christmas." And Nash held up the notebook instead of answering. Gus's face did something complicated, not quite fear, not quite grief, something that had been waiting a long time to be let out and wasn't sure it wanted to be, now that the moment had come. He stepped back from the door without a word and let Nash in. They sat at the kitchen table while the coffee went cold between them, and Gus turned the notebook over in his hands without opening it, running his thumb along the spine like he was checking it was real. "Your great-granddaddy didn't talk about the war," he said finally. "Not the parts most men talked about anyway. He came back from Draper Field in '45 and he was different, and everybody just called it shell shock because that's what you called it then, and nobody asked more than that. But my daddy told me once, just the once, and only because he'd had a few, that Emery used to say he made a promise out there. Not to the army, to something else, and that the something else was still waiting on him to keep it." "Waiting for what?" "He never said. Died at 51, heart gave out working a fence line, and whatever he knew went into the ground with him. All we got left is that ring you're wearing and a story nobody in this family's ever had the nerve to finish telling." Gus looked up at him, and for a second the humor was gone entirely from his face. "You feel anything out there, Nash? Anything you can't put a name to?" Nash thought about the seam of light stitching itself awake at chest height, patient as a held breath. He thought about the warmth under his palm in a building with no power for half a century. He said, "Yeah," and left it there, because some things a man needs to see for himself before somebody else's fear gets tangled up in it. Gus didn't push. He'd lived next to Draper's like his whole life. He knew the shape of not wanting to know more than you had to. But he told Nash one more thing before he left, delivered flat, like a man passing along a debt he was glad to be rid of. 3 separate outfits had tried to buy that parcel off the county over the last 20 years, and every single offer had come from the same source, routed through different names to make it look otherwise. A man named Wallace Tremming, who ran an outfit out of the city calling itself a historical acquisitions firm, and who had wanted Draper Field bad enough to offer the county 4 times its assessed value twice, and been turned down both times because nobody on the council could explain why they didn't want to sell it. They just didn't. Nash was still turning that over in his head when he got back to the shop and found a car in his lot that didn't belong to anybody who needed a transmission fixed, a black sedan, clean in a town where nothing stayed clean, and a man leaning against it in a suit that cost more than Nash's truck. "Mr. Calloway," the man said, straightening up, extending a hand Nash didn't take. "Wallace Tremming, I understand congratulations are in order. Quite the bargain you got yesterday. Word travels. Small county, small auction, not much stays quiet." Tremming smiled the way men smile when they've already decided how a conversation is going to end. "I'll be direct, since I understand you're a busy man. I represent a group interested in Draper Field's historical value. We'd like to make you an offer for the parcel, a real one, not the county's $10, enough to clear whatever's sitting on your books and then some." "How much?" $200,000. Nash didn't let his face move, though it took some effort. $200,000 would clear the note twice over, replace every piece of equipment in the shop that was older than he was, and leave enough left to breathe for the first time in 3 years. He thought about the wall lighting up at chest height. He thought about the sound like a held breath let go. "I'll think about it," he said, which wasn't a no, and Tremin's smile widened like he'd already counted it as a yes. "Don't think too long," Tremin said, sliding back into the car. "Structures like that don't get safer with time, Mr. Calloway. County could pull that access permit whenever it likes. Be ashamed to lose the opportunity entirely." He pulled the door shut, and through the tinted glass, for just a second before the car rolled out of the lot, Nash caught him looking back at the hangar's direction, not toward Nash, not toward the shop, but past both of them, out toward Draper Field, with an expression that had nothing to do with historical value at all. It was hunger, plain and unhidden, the look of a man who had wanted something for 20 years and had just watched it slip one rung further from his reach. Nash didn't sleep on the offer so much as let it sit in the back of his skull all through the evening, needling at him while he did the books, and watched the number in red ink refuse to shrink no matter how he added it. $200,000 would solve every problem he had. It would also mean never going back to that hangar again, never knowing what his great-grandfather had promised, never finding out why a man in an expensive suit wanted 11 acres of condemned scrub badly enough to offer 4 times its worth twice and lie to a county council about who he really was. He drove back out to Draper Field a little after 9, notebook in the passenger seat, and this time he brought a lantern instead of a flashlight, because he had a feeling he was going to need both hands free. The east door was open a foot wider than he'd left it. He stood in the gap a long moment, lantern raised, listening to nothing but his own pulse. The dust in the beam had settled differently than before, not undisturbed anymore, but marked, faint drag lines through it near the base of the hull, like something had walked a slow circuit of the ship sometime in the hours since he'd left. He told himself coyote. He told himself wind through a door he might not have latched properly. He walked in anyway, because he had already decided, somewhere between the shop and the turnoff, that he was done pretending he didn't want to know. He read the notebook by lantern light, sitting on an overturned crate 10 feet from the hull, and the seam at chest height lit again within the first page, like the ship itself was listening along. Emory Calloway's handwriting was cramped and slanted, a young man's hand, and the early pages were ordinary enough, supply requisitions. A girl back home he was writing letters to, complaints about the food. Then, dated a week before the entry stopped making sense as a soldier's diary at all. Something came down 2 nights back, out past the East Ridge, and commands calling it a training accident and telling us all to keep our mouths shut. And I would, except I was on the salvage detail that found it. And there's no aircraft I ever heard of built like that. And there was somebody alive inside it, if you can call what I saw a somebody. Nash's hands had gone still on the page. He kept reading. The entries after that grew sparser, more careful, like a man choosing each word with the awareness that someone might read it over his shoulder someday. Emory described being posted, alone, to guard duty on a structure command wanted kept quiet, the same building. Nash now understood with a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night, that he was sitting inside of right now. He described finding on his 3rd night of guard that the guard post wasn't empty. Something had survived the crash. Not a pilot in any sense. Emory had words for tall, wrong-jointed skin like poured glass gone dark, and dying, slow and clearly in pain, from wounds that Emory's medical training had no name for. I sat with it because there wasn't anything else decent to do. The entry read. The ink pressed hard enough into the page that it had nearly torn through in places. It couldn't speak the way we speak, but it could put things into my head plain as talking, and what it put into my head was this: that the ship carried something it had died to keep hidden, and that it needed someone to promise to keep hidden after, and that it had already looked and hadn't found anybody in the whole outfit it trusted the way it seemed somehow to trust me. I don't know why me. I asked, and the answer I got wasn't words, just a feeling like it already knew the answer and I didn't need to. I said yes because a dying man asks you for a promise, and you don't say no to that, whatever he is. It gave me something before it went. Put its hand, if that's the word, over mine, and there was a burn like a brand that wasn't a burn at all when I looked after. No mark, nothing, except the ring, which I hadn't been wearing when I walked in and was wearing when I walked out, and have not been able to take off since, not that I've tried very hard. It said, and I'm writing this down exact as I can, because I don't ever want to lose the wording. It said the line would carry the promise whether the line remembered making it or not. It said someday someone with my blood in them would come back to this door, and it would know them, and I was not to worry about how, because that part wasn't mine to understand. I was only to keep the door closed and the story quiet until that day came, and trust that whatever was in the walls of that ship would do the rest of the waiting on its own. The entry ended there. The next page was blank, and the page after that, and the rest of the notebook, 40 years of a life reduced to a fence-line heart attack, and a family that never finished the story, was empty, unwritten, as if Emery Calloway had meant to come back to it someday and simply never found the nerve. Nash sat in the lantern light for a long time after he finished reading, the seam of cyan light steady and unblinking on the hull in front of him, and understood, with the particular vertigo of a man realizing the ground under him has never been quite where he thought it was, that he had not bought a scrap metal windfall for $10. He had inherited a debt. Behind him, unhurried, patient as a tide coming in, something in the dark began, very quietly, to wake. He went back 3 more times that week, always at night, because the nights were when the hangar felt less like a condemned building and more like a held breath waiting for him specifically. Each time, more of the hull woke. Not all at once, never all at once, he noticed, like whatever governed it was rationing its own attention, but seam by seam, a slow constellation spreading from that first thread of light near the stern toward the ship's blunt, towering prow, until by the 4th night he could stand in the center of the hangar floor and watch a faint web of cyan tracing the whole visible face of the hull, breathing brighter when he came close and dimmer when he stepped back, like a creature tracking his pulse. He brought better tools on the second visit, a contractor's ladder, a headlamp, a notepad of his own to set alongside his great-grandfather's, and used them to map what he could reach. The hull curved up past 60 feet at its highest point he could measure, easily the length of a football field stem to stern, and nowhere on its surface did he find a single rivet, weld seam, or bolt head that matched anything he'd ever worked on in 30 years of fixing trucks and tractors, and the occasional stubborn combine. The material took his socket wrench's tap with a sound like struck slate, dense and cold under his glove, even where the cyan light ran warm beneath the surface. Twice he found sections of the floor, near the hull's flank, where the concrete had been melted rather than cracked, a smooth, glassy pour that told him something about how the ship had come down that he didn't have the stomach to think through in detail. On the 3rd night he found the door. It wasn't hidden exactly. It had simply never registered as a door, because it bore no handle, no seam a human eye expected, just a section of hull flatter and darker than the curve around it, chest height, exactly where the first light had come alive under his palm on the very first afternoon. He stood in front of it a long while, headlamp beam steady, notebook in one hand, ring on the other, working up the nerve his great-grandfather's handwriting hadn't quite given him. "I don't know what you want from me," he said out loud to the dark plate of metal, feeling foolish and unable to stop himself. "I don't know what he promised you. I just know he promised something, and I'm the only one left who can maybe keep it." The door didn't open, but the light beneath the surface deepened, cyan sliding toward something closer to white at its brightest point, and a pressure moved through the room that he felt in his back teeth more than heard, low and slow, like the room itself had inhaled. Then behind him, not from the ship, not from the door, but from the open dark toward the hangar's far corner, something moved. He spun the headlamp around fast enough to give himself a crick in the neck, and the beam caught nothing but dust settling and shadow retreating. But for one full second before it vanished, he was certain, absolutely certain in the animal part of his brain that didn't argue about things like this, that he had seen the outline of something upright, tall, man-shaped in the way a suggestion is shaped like the thing it's suggesting, angles too clean and too patient to belong to anything that had ever needed to breathe. It hadn't lunged. It hadn't threatened. It had simply been there, watching him from the edge of the light, and then it had chosen not to be. Nash did not run. He wanted to badly, every nerve in his body screaming at him in the flat animal language that predates words, but he made himself stand still and breathe and say, into the settling dark, "I see you." Nothing answered. But when he finally did leave that night, walking backward most of the way to the door because he couldn't make himself turn away from the dark behind him, the drag marks in the dust near the hull's base had changed shape again. A slow, unhurried circuit, the same one he'd noticed the very first night, except now there was a second set of prints alongside his own boot tracks. Faint, three-toed, pressed only lightly into the dust as if whatever made them weighed almost nothing at all, or had simply chosen not to press down harder than it needed to. It was watching him work. It was testing him, in whatever slow and wordless way a thing that old tested anybody. Not with questions, not with trials laid out plain, but with patience, with proximity, with the accumulating weight of a man who kept coming back even when every instinct told him to stop. He told Gus about the shape in the corner over breakfast the next morning, and his great uncle went quiet in a way that was worse than any warning would have been, staring down into his coffee like the surface of it might have an answer written on it. "Your great-granddaddy used to talk in his sleep," Gus said finally. "My daddy told me this part too, near the end, when he wasn't much interested in keeping secrets from anybody anymore. Said Emery used to wake up some nights saying the same 3 words over and over, like a man repeating an order he didn't understand but knew he had to follow. Ward, keep the line. That's what he'd say. Ward, keep the line, over and over, until my daddy shook him awake, and then Emery wouldn't remember saying it at all." Nash felt the hair rise on his arms. "Warden," he said slowly, thinking of the light beneath the door, the pressure in the room like an indrawn breath, the shape at the edge of the dark that had chosen to let itself be seen. "It's not the ship, is it? The ship's not what's out there." "I don't follow." "The ship's just a shell, a vessel, something rode inside it or built into it or bonded to it, I don't know the word for it, something separate. Something that's been standing guard this whole time, and the ship's just what it's guarding." He said it out loud and felt the shape of the whole last week rearrange itself around the idea, clicking into place with the particular cold satisfaction of finally understanding a thing you'd been afraid to look at directly. Everyone who'd ever come near Draper Field over the last 80 years, the surveyors, the backhoe operator, 3 generations of buyers turned away by a county council that couldn't say why had assumed, if they'd thought about it at all, that whatever kept them out was the ship itself. Some derelict weapon system, some failsafe baked into a hull nobody could identify. They'd been wrong the whole time. The ship was dead metal, patient and cold, and utterly incapable of doing anything to anyone. Something else lived in the walls around it, had lived there for 80 years at minimum, maybe far longer, and it was the thing that had broken a backhoe operator's legs and burned out a survey crew's equipment in a single afternoon, and kept a $200,000 offer from ever once tempting a county council into selling. Gus didn't answer for a long moment. Then he said, quiet, "Your great-granddaddy made a promise to something that's been keeping it for 80 years without him being alive to remind it to. That's not a ghost story, Nash. That's a debt with interest, and it's coming due on you." Nash thought about Tremon's face through the tinted glass, that naked hunger aimed out toward Draper Field like a man staring at a door he'd spent 20 years trying to pick the lock on. He thought about the shape at the edge of his headlamp, patient, 3-toed, weighing almost nothing. He thought about his great-grandfather waking in the dark decade after decade, saying the same 3 words to a wife who never understood them, carrying an order in his sleep that his waking mind had let go of the moment he opened his eyes. "I'm going back tonight," he said. "Course you are," Gus said, and for the first time all morning he almost smiled, tired and proud and afraid all at once. "You're a Calloway." None of us ever had the sense to leave well enough alone. Nash left the shop early that afternoon, telling his one part-time hand, a wiry kid named Petey who'd been sweeping floors for him since high school, that he had a family matter to see to and would be back in the morning. He didn't tell Petey what kind of family matter, because he didn't have language for it yet himself, and because some part of him, the same part that hadn't run from the shape in the corner, understood already that whatever was happening out at Draper Field was not the kind of thing you explained standing in a shop doorway with grease on your hands. He didn't notice the sedan 2 turns behind him on the county road, keeping its distance with the patience of a man who'd been waiting 20 years and had decided one more night wouldn't kill him. He would notice it soon enough. He got back to Draper Field a little after 8, dusk burning itself out over the ridge in long orange bands, and he was halfway from his truck to the east door when he heard the second engine. It came in dark, no headlights, which told him everything he needed to know about the intentions of whoever was driving it before he ever saw a face. A panel van, county road dust already caked white over its lower half like it had been sitting somewhere nearby for a while, waiting for full dark the way he should have guessed a man like Tremaine would wait. It pulled off the access road a quarter-mile out and killed its engine, and 4 shapes climbed out of it in the last violet light of dusk, moving with the unhurried efficiency of men who had done this kind of work before and expected no trouble doing it again. Nash ducked behind the corner of the hangar and watched them come, heart going hard and flat against his ribs. They weren't dressed like historical preservation. They had cutting torches, a portable generator on a wheeled cart, and the loose, competent posture of men who got paid by the job and not by the hour, and the one in front, tall, gray at the temples, moving like he was used to being obeyed, Nash recognized even at this distance from the cut of his suit jacket, incongruous against the desert dust. Tremaine hadn't come to make another offer. He'd come to take what he'd been refused, on the theory that a man who owned something for 4 days didn't own it hard enough yet to fight for it. They went in through the west door, the one Nash hadn't bothered fixing because it opened onto nothing but scrub for half a mile, and by the time Nash worked his way around to a gap in the corrugated wall where he could see inside, the generator was already coughing to life, and a work light had gone up on a tripod, throwing a hard white cone across the hangar floor and up the flank of the hull. "Careful with the plating," Tremaine was saying, his voice carrying flat and clear across the empty space. "Whatever this is, it's not scrap. I want sections, clean cuts, nothing melted past use. Clients paying by the intact panel." One of the men crouched at the hull's base with a torch already lit, blue flame hissing, and pressed it toward the seam nearest the floor. The same seam, Nash realized with a jolt, that had been the very first thing to light for him 4 nights ago, warm under his palm in a cold building. The torch flame guttered out. Not flickered, not sputtered from a bad regulator. It went out the way a candle goes out when a door slams somewhere in the house, instant and total, and the man swore and thumbed the igniter twice with no result. And in the sudden quiet that followed, Nash heard, distinctly, from somewhere above and behind the worklight, a sound like a held breath finally released. The cyan web under the hull's surface came alive all at once. It didn't creep this time, didn't ration itself seam by seam the way it had for Nash across 4 patient nights. It bloomed, every fault line in that vast dark surface lighting simultaneously, chest height to 60 feet, and the whole visible length of the hull, a network of lights so sudden and so total that the work light on its tripod looked dim and yellow and small by comparison, a match struck next to a searchlight. The 4 men froze. Even from his gap in the corrugated wall, 30 feet off, Nash felt the pressure of it in his sternum, the room-sized inhale he'd only ever felt as a whisper before now arriving as something closer to a wave. "That's not possible," said the man with the dead torch, backing up fast enough to trip over the generator cable. "That thing's not powered. There's no way that thing's powered." "Keep cutting," Tremon said, though even his voice had lost some of its flat certainty. "Whatever automated defense system that is, it's decades old. It can't do anything but light up." He was wrong within 4 seconds, and Nash would spend a long time afterward trying to find better words for what he watched happen next, and never quite managing it, because nothing in his life before that night had given him a vocabulary for it. The dark plate at chest height, the door, the one Nash had stood in front of and spoken to 2 nights running, didn't so much open as unfold, seams parting soundlessly along lines that hadn't existed a heartbeat before, and out of the gap it left behind, something stepped down onto the hangar floor that had no business fitting through an opening that size and somehow did anyway, folding itself into the room the way a shadow folds around a corner. It stood roughly the height of a tall man, though height was the wrong measure for something that didn't quite obey the geometry Nash's eye wanted to give it, limbs a fraction too long, joints that bent in places a human joint had no reason to bend, a surface like poured obsidian shot through, vein deep, with the same cyan light that ran the length of the hull, pulsing now in a slow rhythm that Nash realized, with a lurch, matched nothing so much as a heartbeat. It had no face that he could call a face. Where a face would have gone there was only a smooth, dark plane, and yet every one of the 4 men in that hangar took an instinctive step backward, the universal human recognition of being looked at by something that saw you completely. "Cutter," Tremon snapped, voice cracking. "Cutter, get it on tape, get it on." The man with the phone raised didn't finish the motion. The worklight's tripod, 6 feet from where he stood, folded flat to the concrete with a metallic shriek that had no visible cause behind it, no hand, no force any of them could point to, and the generator cart beside it tipped and rolled a full 10 feet across the floor as though shoved by something moving too fast to see. The hangar didn't go dark. The hull's own light held steady, cold and vast and everywhere at once. But the humans' light, their tools, their carefully rigged intrusion, came apart around them piece by piece with the patient, contemptuous efficiency of something that had done this exact thing to exact kinds of men many times before, and had grown, over the decades, entirely unbothered by the process. One of the crew ran first, out the west door into the dark, not bothering with his gear. The second followed inside 3 seconds, tripping over the cable he'd laid himself an hour earlier. The third, the one who tried to cut the plating, stood frozen with the dead torch still in his hand, staring up at the shape that had unfolded from the hull. And Nash, watching from his gap in the wall with his heart slamming against his ribs, saw the moment the man's nerve broke entirely. Not from any lunge or threat, because the shape hadn't moved from where it stood, hadn't raised a hand, hadn't done anything Nash could point to as an attack. It had simply turned its faceless head, unhurried, and looked at him, and something about being looked at by it, some weight behind the attention, some certainty of being seen all the way through, dropped the man to his knees on the concrete before he scrambled back up and ran without his tools, without his dignity, into the dark after the others. That left Tremon. He didn't run. Nash would give him that much later, turning the night over in his mind. Whatever else the man was, he wasn't a coward, or he'd buried the fear deep enough under 20 years of wanting this specific thing that it couldn't move his feet. He stood his ground in the cone of the hull's cold light, straightened his jacket with hands that Nash could see shaking even from 30 feet, and looked up at the shape standing between him and the ship he'd spent 2 decades and untold money trying to reach. "I know what you are," Tremon said, and his voice had steadied into something almost reverent, almost hungry again despite everything Nash had just watched. "I've spent 20 years reading every report the county buried, every account from every man who came out here and never talked about it again. Sentinel class. Bonded construct. I know what's under that hull, and I know you're not going to hurt me, because whatever you're protecting doesn't want a body found on county land drawing questions. So let's talk business. I can offer things a farm boy in a repair shop can't. Resources. Protection. A way to move whatever's under there somewhere it'll actually be studied instead of rusting in a condemned hangar for another 80 years. The shape didn't answer him. It didn't need to, and its silence, Nash understood watching from the dark, was its own kind of answer, flat, total, uninterested. The silence of something that had heard every offer a hungry man could make across 80 years of guard duty and had never once found one worth a response. Tremin's composure cracked at the edges. "Fine," he said, backing toward the west door at last, some final piece of nerve giving out under that unblinking attention. "Fine. You've got time, I'll grant you that. I don't. There's more than one way onto this property, and I've got patience your farm boy doesn't have a bank account for. Enjoy your $10, Calloway." He said it loud enough to carry, and Nash understood with a cold drop in his stomach that Tremin had known he was there the whole time, watching from the dark same as everything else in that building. Then Tremin was gone into the night after his crew, and the generator cart rolled to a slow stop against the far wall, and the hangar settled into a quiet so complete that Nash could hear his own pulse in his ears. The shape did not fold itself back into the hull. It stood where it was, faceless, patient, cyan light pulsing slow through the dark of its surface, and after a long moment it turned, not fast, not threatening, simply turned, the way a man turns when he hears a familiar step behind him, toward the gap in the corrugated wall where Nash had been standing, unmoving, for longer than he could have said. It had known he was there too. Of course it had. It had probably known before he did. Nash stepped out of the dark, hands loose and open at his sides, and walked toward it across the ruined hangar floor, past the toppled generator and the abandoned cutting torch, and stopped 10 feet short of where it stood, close enough now to feel the pressure of its attention like heat off a stove. "I'm not here to cut your ship apart," he said, and his voice only shook a little. "I already told you that. I don't think you needed me to say it twice, but I'm saying it anyway, because I figure that's what a promise sounds like when you mean to keep it." The light along its surface deepened, Cyan sliding toward that near-white brightness he'd seen once before at the sealed door, and for the first time since it had stepped into the room, it moved toward him, one slow, unhurried pace, then another, closing the distance between them until it stood close enough that Nash had to tilt his head back to keep that smooth, dark plane where a face should be in his line of sight. It raised one long, wrong-jointed hand, palm out, and held it there, motionless, an offering or a test or both at once, close enough that Nash could feel warmth radiating off it like sun-baked stone. He understood, without being told, exactly what it was waiting for. He lifted his own hand, the one with the ring, and pressed his palm flat against its own. The contact didn't hurt. That surprised him more than almost anything else that had happened since he'd walked into that hangar with a pair of bolt cutters he hadn't needed. Some part of him had braced for pain, for the burn his great-grandfather's notebook had described, and then denied describing in the same breath. And instead what came through the ring and up his arm and into the center of his chest was something closer to recognition, cold and vast and utterly without malice. Like a held door, finally letting you in out of whether you hadn't realized you'd been standing in for years. He didn't hear words. His great-grandfather had written that down plain enough, and Nash understood now exactly what he'd meant. It wasn't sound, wasn't language in any shape his ears would have known what to do with. It was pressure and shape, arriving directly into the part of his mind that held meaning before meaning ever got translated into words at all. The way you understand a slammed door means anger before you've consciously registered the sound of its slamming. What arrived was this: a ship, whole and gleaming, nothing like the dead hull behind him, cutting through a dark full of more stars than he'd ever seen from any desert night in his life. A fleet around it, dozens of ships the same shape, moving in a formation that had the patient, deliberate geometry of ritual rather than war. A cargo held in the deepest part of this ship. He couldn't see its shape, only felt the vast, careful weight of it, the sense of something too dangerous to destroy and too important to lose, entrusted the way you'd entrust a coal in a covered pot, small and banked and capable, if ever it woke fully, of burning down everything around it. He understood, without being told in words, that this ship and its fleet had carried such cargoes across the dark for longer than his species had known how to count years, and that this was only one of many, scattered and hidden and guarded, each one bound to its own patient keeper, waiting out the long centuries in whatever quiet corner of whatever world had needed them least. Then, violence, sudden and total, an attack out of the dark that the vision gave him only in fragments, the way a man remembers a car wreck, light too bright metal screaming, the formation broken apart around them, this ship alone and falling a long way through black and then through blue sky, and then through air that burned, coming to rest hard and broken in a desert that would, decades later, grow a training airstrip up around the crater it left. Then, a figure, tall and wrong-jointed and dying, skin like poured glass gone dark, cradled by a young soldier in a uniform Nash's great-grandfather had once worn, and a promise passed between them in the same wordless pressure Nash was feeling now, and a ring slipping onto a hand that hadn't been wearing it a moment before. Then 80 years of patient, solitary waiting, failed claimants, a backhoe operator's shattered legs, a survey crew's equipment failing all at once, a man in an expensive suit offering money across 2 decades to a county council that could never say why it kept refusing him. And through all of it, underneath all of it, a single unbroken thread of attention aimed at one bloodline, waiting for it to produce someone who would come back through that door not for the scrap value of the metal, but because a debt had been called and answered. The vision ended the way it began, all at once, and Nash staggered a half-step back, breathing hard, his palms still pressed to the construct's own. It let him go gently, lowering its hand, and the pressure in his chest eased into something more bearable, something closer to a held note finally resolving. The cartographer, Nash said, the word arriving in his mouth before he understood where it had come from, some fragment of the vision surfacing into language the only way it could. That's what he was, not a pilot, a cartographer. The construct's faceless plane tilted, the barest fraction, and motion that Nash would come to recognize over the following days as its version of acknowledgement. It didn't speak, not yet, not in words he could carry away and repeat to his uncle over cold coffee, but something in its stillness confirmed what he'd said was close enough to true to let stand. "And you," Nash said. "You're not the ship." The tilt again, deeper this time. "You're the thing that's supposed to keep the promise he made. You're the warden." He said it and felt the words settle into place with a certainty that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the way the room itself seemed to hold still around it, the hull's light dimming by some fraction as if in agreement or relief or both. It did not confirm the word outright, but it did not deny it either, and for the first time since he'd stood in front of that sealed door 2 nights running and spoken to a wall that hadn't yet chosen to answer him, Nash felt something in the room that hadn't been there before, not just attention, not just patience, but the faint, careful beginning of trust, offered the way you offer trust to a stray dog that's finally stopped flinching at your hand. He came back the next 4 nights running, and each night the warden gave him more, never in the overwhelming flood of that first contact, but in smaller pieces, doled out with the same rationed patience it had used lighting the hulls seams one by one across his first 4 visits. He learned that it did not sleep, not in any sense he understood sleep, but existed in something closer to a long patient stillness that could be interrupted and resumed without loss. He learned that the ship's own systems, its actual defenses, whatever weapons or shielding the cartographer's fleet had once carried, had died in the crash decades before Emery Callaway ever set foot near the wreck, burned out entirely in the same violence that had killed everyone else aboard. The hull in front of him had no teeth left of its own. Everything Draper's luck had ever done to the men who tried to claim it, the broken legs, the failed equipment, the quiet refusals no county councilman could explain, every bit of it had come from the warden alone, working with whatever means a bonded guardian construct had at its disposal after its ship's own strength had burned away to nothing. That fact settled into Nash slow over those 4 nights and grew heavier the longer he sat with it. The battleship, because that was the only word that fit its scale, whatever gentler word the cartographer's people might have used for it, had been nothing but a dead hulk since before Nash's own grandfather was born. It couldn't have hurt a fly. Every ounce of protection Draper Field had ever needed, across 8 decades and 3 failed development ventures, and one man's 20-year campaign of buried offers, had come from a single patient figure standing guard over a corpse it refused to abandon, because a dying stranger had once asked it to, and it had never once, in all that time, considered breaking its word. He asked it on the 3rd of those 4 nights, sitting cross-legged on the hangar floor with his great-grandfather's notebook open on his knee, what the cargo actually was, the thing the cartographer's ship had died protecting, the coal banked and covered in the deepest hold of a dead battleship. The warden's answer came the way all its answers came, pressure and shape rather than words, and what arrived this time was less a picture than a warning, blunt and absolute. Not yet. Not until the line is proven. Not until the promise is finished being kept and not begun being sold. Nash understood the shape of that warning well enough without needing it spelled out in words. Tremaine had offered him $200,000 for a shell he thought was empty, and had sent 4 men with cutting torches when the offer failed, and both times the warden had made its answer plain without a single word passing between it and the man asking. Whatever slept in that ship's deepest hold, it was not a thing that got sold, borrowed, studied, or moved, not by Nash and not by anyone else, not until the warden itself decided the promise had been fully honored rather than merely inherited. He didn't ask again after that. Some questions he was starting to understand. A man earned the right to ask by not asking them too soon. Petey covered the shop those 4 days without much complaint, though by the 4th morning he'd started giving Nash a look that suggested he suspected a woman was involved, which Nash didn't correct, because the truth would have gotten him a very different look entirely. Gus came out to Draper Field twice, standing well back from the hull with his hat in his hands, and the second time, when the warden turned its faceless attention his way, the old man went pale and quiet and didn't speak again until they were back in the truck driving home. "It looked at me like it knew me," Gus said finally, staring out the windshield at the dark road. "Like it's been carrying my daddy's face and my daddy's face around in whatever passes for its memory this whole time, filing us all under the same name, waiting on the right one to walk back through that door." "You scared of it?" Gus thought about that a long moment. "No," he said, "I'm scared of what it means that it's real. Man spends his whole life hearing a story and telling himself it's just a story, and then his nephew goes and proves it wasn't, and now there's no going back to not knowing." He glanced over. "You gonna keep it, Nash? The promise?" "Because I want to say yes for you, easy as that, but it's not my ring on your hand, and it's not your shop drowning in red ink, and $200,000 doesn't stop being real money just because something ancient and unkillable is standing in front of it saying no." Nash didn't answer right away. He thought about the shop, the unopened bank letter still sitting on the workbench, the note that grew a little heavier every month he didn't clear it. He thought about the vision the warden had given him, the fleet in the dark, the coal banked and covered, 80 years of one patient figure standing guard over nothing but a dead man's word. He thought about his great-grandfather waking in the night for 30 years running, saying 3 words in his sleep to a wife who never understood them, carrying an order his waking mind had refused to keep hold of. "Yeah," he said, "I'm keeping it." Gus nodded slow, like a man setting down something heavy he'd been carrying a long time, and didn't say anything else the rest of the drive. Tremaine, it turned out, had not spent those 4 quiet nights doing nothing. Nash found that out on the 5th morning, when a certified letter arrived at the shop with the county seal on it, informing Nash Calloway, owner of record, that Hangar C, Draper Field, had been flagged for emergency structural review following an anonymous safety complaint, and that the county reserved the right to order immediate demolition of any structure found to pose an imminent hazard to public safety, effective on completion of said review. The review, the letter noted, was scheduled for 6 days out. Nash read it twice at the counter, Petey watching him from across the shop with a wrench forgotten in his hand, and understood exactly what he was looking at. Tremaine couldn't buy the Hangar. He couldn't strip it by force, not after what 4 men with cutting torches had learned about that in one bad night. So he had found the one lever left that didn't require getting anywhere near the warden at all: county paperwork, an anonymous complaint, a demolition order that would flatten Hangar C to rubble and bury whatever was inside it under tons of collapsed steel and concrete before anyone as inconvenient as a guardian construct could do a single thing to stop a wrecking crew that never had to set foot past the perimeter fence. 6 days. Nash folded the letter once, put it in his jacket pocket next to his great-grandfather's notebook, and went to find his truck keys. The county clerk's office was a single overworked room above the annex, staffed by a woman named Darla who had processed Nash's shop's business license 3 years running, and greeted him now with the particular weariness of someone who already suspected what he'd come to ask about. "Anonymous complaint," she said, pulling the file without needing him to explain, sliding it across the counter so he could see the form himself. "Filed Tuesday. Structural hazard, imminent collapse risk, cites deteriorating roof trusses and unstable foundation." She tapped the box marked complainant with one finger. "See how that's blank? Anonymous complaints on county land are supposed to require a follow-up affidavit within 48 hours or they get dropped automatic. This one's got a stamped waiver from the assistant commissioner's office instead. That's not how it usually goes." "Who's the assistant commissioner?" "Wendell Hooks. Also happens to golf on Thursdays with a fella, runs a historical acquisitions firm out of the city. I'm not saying anything, Mr. Calloway, because I like my job and my pension, but I'm also not blind, and neither are you." Nash thanked her and drove straight to the county library, where a retired schoolteacher named Marian Osei ran the local history archive out of a converted storage room 3 afternoons a week, and where he spent 2 hours going through box after box of yellowed newspaper clippings and Army Air Corps correspondence that the Historical Society had never quite finished cataloging. He found what he was looking for in the 4th box, a single-column item from the local paper, dated 3 days after his great-grandfather's journal entry about the crash, reporting a training exercise malfunction at Draper Field that had, according to the base's public statement, resulted in no casualties and no lasting damage. The article ran 1 paragraph. It was the only mention of anything unusual at Draper Field in the entire archive, sandwiched between a report on a county fair and a notice about rationed sugar, and Nash understood, reading it, that whoever had buried the real story 80 years ago had done a thorough job of it, thorough enough that not even a dedicated local archivist 3 afternoons a week for a decade had ever thought twice about it. Marian herself, when he asked her directly whether Draper Field had ever come up for a historic designation review, went very still behind her reading glasses. "Twice," she said. "Once in the 90s, once about 8 years back. Both times somebody with more pull than me made sure the application never got past county review. I always assumed it was because nobody wanted to pay for the environmental cleanup a designation would require. I take it you know something different." "I might," Nash said, and left it there, because Marion Osei struck him as exactly the kind of person who'd ask a follow-up question he wasn't ready to answer yet. He drove back out to Draper Field that evening with the newspaper clipping and a photocopy of the buried designation applications folded into his jacket alongside his great-grandfather's notebook, and found the warden waiting for him in the middle of the hangar floor, unmoving, patient, its light banked low and steady the way it had learned, over their last several nights together, to hold itself while it waited on him. He told it about the demolition order. He wasn't certain, even as he spoke, how much of it needed saying out loud versus how much it already understood through whatever channel had let it track every visitor to Draper Field for 80 years without needing eyes. But he told it anyway, because some things a man needs to say plain, out loud, to feel like he's actually decided them rather than just letting them happen to him. 6 days, he finished. County review, and if it goes the way Tremens paid for it to go, they flatten this whole building before we're done talking. I don't know if that hurts you. I don't know if it hurts whatever's in the deep hold. But I know it buries the promise for good, one way or the other, and I didn't come all this way to let that happen because a man in a good suit knows how to grease a county calendar." The warden was still a long moment. Then it turned, unhurried, and moved toward the sealed door at chest height, the one that had unfolded itself the night the cutting crew came, and had stayed shut every night since, patient as everything else about it. And this time it opened wider, the seams parting further than Nash had yet seen, revealing not the dead outer plating of the hull's flank but a corridor beyond it, low-ceilinged and dark, and running back into the ship's body further than his headlamp beam could follow. It looked back at him, the barest tilt of that faceless plane, and stepped inside. Nash followed, because there was nothing else left in him that would have let him do otherwise. The corridor ran deeper than the hangar itself should have allowed, curving twice before it opened into a chamber that made the breath go out of him in one long involuntary rush. A space the size of an aircraft hangar in its own right, ribbed with structure that arced overhead like the inside of some vast fossilized ribcage, every surface dark and cold, and unpowered except for a single column at the chamber's far end, banked low with the same cyan light that ran the hull outside. Pulsing slow and steady like something sleeping and dreaming, rather than dead. Nash understood, without needing the warden to tell him, that he was looking at the covered coal itself, the cargo the cartographer's fleet had died carrying, banked low and contained, and for now, still safely asleep. But the warden didn't lead him toward the column. It led him instead to a section of the chamber wall nearer the corridor mouth, where a panel had come loose sometime in the last 80 years. Vibration, decades of settling, some slow structural fatigue that had nothing dramatic about it and everything to do with the simple fact that even the most ancient materials eventually tired, exposing a tangle of conduit behind it that ran, Nash could see even without understanding a tenth of what he was looking at, in a direct line toward the base of that banked, dreaming column. The warden held one long, wrong-jointed hand out toward the gap and let it fall still there, and the meaning arrived in Nash's chest the same wordless way everything else had. This had been failing for years. Slowly. A hairline fracture in the containment feed, not yet critical, but worsening with every season of heat and cold the desert threw at a hull with no working systems left to compensate for it. Whatever demolition crew Tremens' money eventually sent, however careful they claimed they'd be, the vibration of heavy machinery against that hull would very likely be the thing that finished what 80 years of quiet decay had already started. And the warden could not fix it. Nash understood that too, watching it hold its hand near the gap without ever quite touching the conduit inside. Its own fingers, wrong-jointed, built for a different purpose entirely, too large and too rigid for work that needed the kind of fine, patient dexterity no construct of its scale had ever been built to perform. It had watched this fracture worsen for years, powerless to do the one small, human-scale thing that might have stopped it, because the hands it had were the wrong hands for the job, and it had waited, the same patient way it waited for everything, for a set of hands built the way this task needed them built. Nash looked at the gap in the wall, narrow, awkward, exactly the kind of tight, blind workspace he'd spent half his adult life reaching into on the underside of a truck, with a headlamp strapped to his skull, and a socket set balanced on his knee, and felt something in him settle that had nothing to do with fear at all. "I need my tools," he said, "the good ones. Not what's in the truck." He drove back to the shop that night, and returned before dawn with a rolling case he hadn't touched since his father's funeral, fine picks and a jeweler's loop, and a soldering iron with a tip narrow enough for work most men in his trade never had cause to attempt. And he spent the next 2 days on his back and his knees in a gap in an alien hull, working by headlamp and feel, translating 80 years of failing alien engineering into a problem his hands already knew how to solve, because a fracture was a fracture, and a feed line was a feed line, whatever language its original builders had drawn the schematics in. The warden stood over him the whole time, unmoving, patient, its attention a steady pressure against his back that stopped feeling like being watched somewhere in the first few hours and started feeling like something closer to being trusted. He got the fracture sealed on the evening of the second day, hands shaking with fatigue, headlamp battery dying, and felt the whole chamber exhale around him the moment the last connection held, the banked column at the far end brightening by some small, grateful fraction, the pressure in his chest easing into something he didn't have a better word for than relief that wasn't only his own. The warden knelt beside him, actually knelt, folding itself down to his level for the first time since he'd met it, a gesture that felt, even from something built along lines nothing human had ever used, unmistakably like respect, and pressed its palm flat against the back of his hand, the ring between them, and this time the pressure that moved up his arm carried no vision at all. Only a single clear certainty, arriving whole and complete the way the truest things always seem to. Not yet finished, it told him without words, without sound. Close. Nash sat back against the cold hull, spent and aching, and for the first time in 6 days, something close to steady, and understood that whatever trial the warden had been quietly running him through since the night it first put its palm against his, the vision, the waiting, the slow accumulation of trust, and now this, hands doing the one thing 80 years of patience alone had never been able to accomplish, was very nearly done. 4 days left before the county's review. He had a feeling he was going to need every one of them. He spent the 3rd day of his 4 remaining ones inside the county annex instead of the hangar, wearing a clean shirt Gus had ironed for him without being asked, sitting across a folding table from Marion Ose, and a lawyer named Priscilla Van, who did most of her work out of a strip mall office 2 towns over, and had never in 15 years of small claims and property disputes had a client walk in with quite the file Nash laid out in front of her. He didn't tell her about the warden. He'd thought hard about that line on the drive over and decided, somewhere around the second gas station, that there were some truths a county review board would never sit still for, and that the truth he did have, buried newspaper clippings, 2 suppressed historic designation applications, a certified letter with an anonymous complaint waved through by an assistant commissioner who golfed on Thursdays with the very man who'd twice tried to buy the parcel under a shell company's name, was more than enough to work with on its own. Priscilla Van read through the folder twice, slower the second time, and looked up at him with the particular narrow focus of a lawyer who's just realized a case she thought would take an afternoon is actually going to take considerably longer and be considerably more interesting. "This assistant commissioner," she said, "Hooks, he signed off on waiving the standard affidavit requirement for an anonymous complaint. That's not just irregular, Mr. Calloway. That's the kind of thing that ends careers if it's laid out right in front of the right people. And these two designation applications filed, reviewed, and quietly killed both times. No public record of why. That's a pattern. 1. Denials and oversight. 2. With the same firm's fingerprints showing up in the county correspondence, both times if you squint. That's obstruction, and county boards get very nervous about the word obstruction showing up in a public meeting. Can you stop the demolition? I can delay it. I can force a public hearing instead of a quiet administrative sign-off, which is not what Mr. Hooks was hoping for when he stamped that waiver. Whether I can stop it outright depends on how loud we get and how fast. She tapped the folder. You said your families had a connection to this property since the war. Anything to that beyond sentiment. Historic designations move faster with a documented human story attached. County boards like a widow, a veteran, something they can put a face to besides a line item. Nash thought of his great-grandfather's cramped handwriting, 40 years of an unfinished notebook, 3 words spoken in his sleep to a wife who never understood them. Yeah, he said. There's something to it. They filed for an emergency public hearing that afternoon. Marion Ose, standing beside him at the counter as a co-signer on the historic designation renewal. And Priscilla Van walked the whole packet personally down to the commissioner's office, rather than trust it to interoffice mail. Because she said plainly that a packet like this one had a way of getting lost if it sat in the wrong inbox even an hour longer than it had to. The hearing was set for the morning of the 6th day. The same morning, Nash noted with a cold drop in his stomach that the structural review had originally been scheduled to green-light demolition. It would be close. It would be close enough that Priscilla Van told him plainly, walking him out to his truck, not to count on paperwork alone to save that hangar, because paperwork moved at the speed of county government, and county government had never in its history moved as fast as a man with $200,000 and 20 years of patience wanted it to. She was righter than either of them knew. Nash drove back out to Draper Field that evening to tell the warden what little there was to tell, a hearing, a chance, nothing certain, and found the access road blocked a quarter-mile out by a second-panel van, newer than the first, and 3 pickup trucks pulled off onto the scrub beside it, and men moving equipment in the fading light with the brisk, unbothered competence of people who'd been paid enough not to ask too many questions about the job. He didn't recognize any of the 4 from the cutting crew Tremaine had sent before. These men moved differently. No torches, no scrap-hauling gear, but crates stenciled with markings Nash didn't recognize and didn't like the look of, and a portable frame rig that looked less like salvage equipment, and more like something built for moving something heavy and dangerous without ever having to touch it directly. Tremaine stood at the center of it, no longer bothering with the expensive suit, dressed instead in field gear that told Nash plainly the man had stopped pretending this was a negotiation sometime in the last 6 days. Mr. Calloway, Tremaine said, not turning from the crate he was overseeing when Nash came close enough to be heard. I did warn you there was more than one way onto this property. Your lawyer's hearing is a lovely gesture, truly, but hearings take a morning, and I only need about 4 hours of uninterrupted access tonight to be done with all this permanently. You're not getting in that hangar. I got in once already. Your friend in there made its point, I'll grant it that, and I've adjusted accordingly. Tremaine finally turned, and in the dying light Nash saw, slung over the shoulders of the 2 nearest men, containment gear that looked less like salvage tools and more like something built to handle materials nobody wanted to touch, bare-handed, heavy shielded gauntlets, a lead-lined case the size of a footlocker. I'm not here to cut plating tonight. I'm here for the cargo directly, and I've brought people equipped to retrieve dangerous material without needing to get anywhere near whatever scared my last crew half to death. There are protocols for this, Mr. Calloway. My employer didn't get into this business without learning a few things about handling material that doesn't want to be handled. Nash felt the ground tilt under him in a way that had nothing to do with the desert dark. Tremaine wasn't bluffing about the equipment, and worse, wasn't bluffing about what he understood the cargo to actually be, not scrap metal, not historical curiosity, but something dangerous enough that a black market buyer somewhere had already trained a crew and built specialized gear specifically for extracting it. The warden had told him not yet, not until the promise is finished being kept, and Nash understood now, standing in the dark with Tremaine's crew unloading shielded cases 20 feet away, exactly what kind of catastrophe not yet was standing between. "You don't know what's in there," Nash said. "I know enough. I know it's valuable enough that a government black-budget line item paid to have it recovered 80 years ago, and then quietly wrote off the operation when the recovery team never came home. I know there's a reason nobody's ever managed to buy this parcel outright no matter how much money got offered, and I know a construct standing guard over dead metal for 80 years isn't standing guard over nothing." Tremaine's composure had gone hard and flat, the reasonable businessman's mask finally, fully off. "I've spent 20 years and more money than you'll make in your whole life chasing this one parcel, Mr. Calloway. I am not walking away from it because a farm boy inherited a lucky ring." He raised a hand, and the crew began moving toward the west door in a loose formation that had clearly been drilled beforehand, shielded gauntlets and lead-lined cases, and a portable frame rig rolling ahead of them across the scrub. And Nash understood, with a clarity that steadied rather than panicked him, that there was no more time left for paperwork, no more time left for hearings scheduled 6 days out, no more time left for anything except getting to that hangar before Tremaine's crew did. He ran. He beat them to the east door by less than a minute, lungs burning, and threw it open into a hangar already lit, not by any work light Tremaine's crew had rigged, but by the hull itself, every seam blazing at once the way it had the night of the first cutting crew, cyan light so total it threw his own shadow long and hard across the concrete floor. The warden was already standing in the open, faceless plane turned toward the west door where the sound of Tremaine's approaching crew carried clear across the still night air, and Nash understood, crossing the floor toward it at a dead run, that it had known this was coming before he had, the same way it had known everything else. "They've got containment gear," Nash said, gasping the words out between breaths. "Lead-lined cases, shielded gauntlets. Tremaine knows what's in the deep hold or knows enough. He's not cutting plating tonight, he's coming straight for the cargo." The warden's light deepened, cyan sliding hard toward white, and the pressure that arrived in Nash's chest this time carried none of the patient stillness he'd grown used to across their last week together. It carried something closer to alarm, the first genuine urgency he'd felt from it since the night it stepped down from the hull to scatter a cutting crew with nothing but a look. And beneath the alarm, something that took him a moment to place, because he'd never felt it from the construct before. Fear not for itself. For the thing sleeping in the deep hold, banked low and dreaming, and if Tremaine's crew got as far as that column with shielded gauntlets and a lead-lined case built for exactly this purpose, entirely undefended against men who knew how to move dangerous cargo without waking it first. The west door burst inward. They came in fast, 6 of them now instead of 4, moving with the drilled economy of a crew that had rehearsed exactly this entry, portable frame rig rolling ahead on silent wheels, shielded gauntlets already raised. Tremaine came in behind them, no longer bothering with any pretense of negotiation, and the moment the hull's light hit his face Nash saw something in his expression that hadn't been there in the parking lot outside the shop 6 days ago. Not hunger anymore, not exactly, but the flat, focused calculation of a man who had already decided the guardian standing in front of him was an obstacle to be managed rather than a mystery to be respected. "Standard formation," Tremaine called out, voice carrying hard across the hangar. "It won't attack you directly, it never has, not once in 80 years of documented incidents. It disables equipment. Your gear's shielded against exactly that. Move." The warden moved to meet them. It didn't unfold into violence the way Nash half expected, half dreaded, no sudden strike, no crushing blow, nothing that would have confirmed Tremin's flat assumption that it was harmless to living men no matter how thoroughly it dismantled their tools. Instead, it simply placed itself, unhurried and immovable, directly between the advancing crew and the sealed door at chest height that led back into the ship's deep corridor, and stood there the way a mountain stands, offering nothing to strike and nothing to move around. The first man reached for it with a shielded gauntlet raised, some plan already briefed into him about pinning or restraining, and the moment his hand closed on empty air where the construct's arm had been a half-second before, Nash understood that Tremin's crew had drilled against a threat that had never once, in 80 years, actually tried to fight back, and had no idea at all what they were looking at now, that the promise being tested was no longer patience but protection. The hull's light didn't just brighten this time. It moved, a slow wave of brightness rolling the full length of that vast dark surface from stern to prow, gathering at the sealed door the way water gathers before it breaks, and Nash felt the pressure of it in his teeth, his sternum, the marrow of his own bones, vast and total, and entirely unlike anything the construct had shown him across their whole week of careful, rationed trust. "Get back," he shouted at the crew, though he had no authority over any of them and no reason to think they'd listen. "Get back. You don't understand what you're—" The floor shook. It wasn't the warden that did it. Nash understood a half-second later, chest tight with a fear that had nothing to do with Tremin's crew at all. It was the ship itself, dead metal for 80 years, groaning awake along some structural memory of alarm that had nothing to do with weapon systems long since burned to nothing, and everything to do with a hull's last instinct to protect what it carried. Dust sifted down from the reinforced ceiling in fine gray sheets. Somewhere deep in the hangar's bones, a sound rose that Nash had only heard once before, faint, the night the sealed door first opened for him. A held breath, except now it was not one breath but many, the whole vast dead structure exhaling at once, a sound with no mechanical source that any of them could point to, and every ounce of menace a corpse that size could carry even with its own teeth long gone. Two of Tremin's crew broke and ran without needing to be told twice. A third dropped his shielded case and followed. Tremin himself stood his ground a moment longer, jaw set, some last reserve of nerve or greed keeping his feet planted even as the floor shook harder under him. And it was in that moment, Nash would understand later, that the warden made its decision not to strike Tremin down, not to hurt him, because in 80 years it never once had, but to end the argument entirely and finally, in the one language a man like Tremin had never once managed to argue his way past. It turned to face him fully, close enough now that Tremin had to look up, and the light along its surface gathered at its open palm, brightening past white into something that had no easy name, and it raised that hand not to strike. Nash saw with a lurch of understanding, but simply to be seen, to let a man who had spent 20 years and a fortune trying to reach past it finally look, for one unbearable second, at exactly what he had been trying to steal from. Whatever Tremin saw in that light broke something in him that his composure had held together through 6 days of escalating failure. He staggered back a full step, hand flying up to shield his eyes though the light did nothing that should have hurt them, and when he found his voice again, it came out thin and stripped of every ounce of the flat, moneyed certainty he'd carried into that hangar with him. "It's not possible," he said. 80 years and it's not just a machine, It's a promise," Nash said, stepping up beside the warden, close enough now that its light washed warm across his own face, close enough that he felt, for the first time since he'd first pressed his palm against its own, entirely certain of which side of this argument he stood on. "You spent 20 years trying to buy something that was never for sale, and 6 days trying to steal something that isn't yours to take, and all you ever needed to understand from the very first night is that it wasn't ever going to matter how much money you had. It doesn't want money. It doesn't want to be studied. It wants exactly one thing, and it's had it for 80 years, and it's not letting go of it now because a man in field gear showed up with a lead-lined case. Tremaine looked at him, really looked, Nash thought, maybe for the first time since the parking lot outside the shop, and something in the man's face, under the fear and the fading greed, looked for one brief unguarded second almost like grief, the particular hollow grief of chasing something for 20 years only to understand, all at once and far too late, that it had never once been within his reach at all. "You don't even know what it's guarding," Tremaine said, backing toward the door, voice gone rough. "You've been out here a week. I've studied this for 20 years, and I still don't fully know what's down there, and you're going to stand there and tell me you're satisfied not knowing." "I'm satisfied trusting the ones who do," Nash said. "That's the whole difference between you and me, Mr. Tremaine. You wanted to own it. I just wanted to keep my word." Tremaine didn't answer that. He gathered what remained of his composure, called something sharp, and clipped to the two crew members still frozen near the west door, and left the way he'd come, boots fast on the concrete, and Nash heard the panel van's engine turn over somewhere out in the dark a minute later, and then the second minute after that, the sound of tires on gravel fading out toward the county road, and not, this time, coming back. The floor stopped shaking. The hull's light settled slow from that unbearable white gathering back down into its familiar patient cyan, seam by seam, the way it had first woken for him 9 days before. The dust in the air drifted and thinned. And the warden turned, at last, fully toward Nash, and folded down onto one knee on the concrete floor, not collapse, not exhaustion, but the same deliberate gesture of respect it had shown him once already, kneeling beside a repaired conduit 2 days before, except this time it did not simply press its palm against his hand and let a wordless certainty pass between them. This time, for the first time in 80 years of silence, it spoke. The words did not arrive in sound. They arrived the way everything else had, pressure and shape resolving into meaning inside the part of his mind that held language closest to the bone, but they arrived shaped, deliberate, chosen the way a man chooses the words for a vow he has waited a very long time to finally say out loud. "Warden Blood, you have come home." Nash stood in the settling dust and the cooling light, and felt something in his chest come undone that he hadn't fully known was still holding tight. Not relief, not exactly, and not triumph either, but something closer to the particular ache of finally setting down a weight he hadn't chosen to carry and had carried anyway, all the way to the end, because a dying stranger had once asked a young soldier for a promise, and a young soldier had said yes, and 80 years and 3 generations later. None of it had been for nothing. "Warden Blood," he repeated, quiet, testing the shape of it. "Is that what I am now?" The construct rose from its knee, and though its face gave him nothing to read, the light running through it had gone warm and steady in a way Nash understood, without needing words for it this time, as something very close to peace. "That," it told him without sound, "is what you have always been. I was only ever waiting for you to come and be it." He didn't drive home that night. He sat with his back against the cool concrete near the hangar's east door, the notebook open on his knee though he wasn't reading it anymore, just holding it, and the warden stood a slow, patient watch beside him the way it must have stood 10,000 nights before he was ever born, and somewhere past 3 in the morning he finally let himself sleep, right there on the floor of the thing he'd bought for $10, and a debt he hadn't known he owed. He woke to Gus shaking his shoulder and pale morning light coming thin through the east door, and for one long disoriented moment, he couldn't tell whether the last 9 days had actually happened or whether he'd fallen asleep at the shop workbench and dreamed the whole thing from a sentence in a book he'd read once as a boy. Then he saw the hull rising up dark and vast above him, seems quiet now, banked low the way a fire banks low overnight rather than going out, and he remembered all of it at once, whole and solid and real. "Petey called me at 5, Gus said, crouching stiff-kneed beside him. "Said a van full of men tore out of your shop lot last night looking like they'd seen the devil himself, and that Wallace Tremon's secretary called this morning asking whether you'd be willing to discuss dropping your, quote, historical designation nonsense, in exchange for the county quietly withdrawing the demolition order, and everybody walking away pretending none of the last week happened. Nash sat up slow, joints aching from a night on concrete. He's scared. He ought to be. You should see what Priscilla Van's been doing while you were out here playing security guard for a dead battleship. Gus held up a folded newspaper, the county's little twice-weekly. Not much of a paper, but read cover to cover by nearly everybody in 3 towns who mattered. Waiver Scandal ROCKS County Office. The headline read, and under it, smaller. Assistant Commissioner Hooks placed on leave amid questions over anonymous complaint out of county acquisitions firm. She didn't waste any time, Nash said, and felt something loosen in his chest for the first time in what felt like a very long week. Woman smelled blood the second you handed her that folder. Called in a favor from a reporter friend of hers last night, soon as your lawyer heard from the clerk's office that Hooks had gone quiet and stopped returning calls. County boards spooked now, Nash. Spooked officials don't demolish anything, historic or not. They hold hearings and cover their own backsides first and figure out the rest later. Gus helped him up, knees popping in the cool morning air. Hearings in 3 hours. You'd best go home and put on a clean shirt, because half the county's going to be in that room, and every one of them's going to be looking at the Callaway boy who bought Draper's Luck for $10 and didn't die of it. The hearing room in the county annex sat maybe 80 people on a good day, and Nash counted closer to 130 packed into it by the time the board chairwoman called the meeting to order. Folding chairs dragged in from the break room to line the back wall, farmers and shop owners, and a handful of reporters he didn't recognize sitting shoulder to shoulder with people he'd known his whole life who had never once, in all the years he could remember, shown the slightest interest in a county zoning matter. Draper's Luck had been a story people told with a shrug for 80 years. Word that the story had teeth had a way of filling a room fast. Priscilla Van laid out the case with the flat, unhurried precision of a woman who'd spent the whole night preparing, and meant every word she said to land exactly once. She walked the board through the waived affidavit, through Assistant Commissioner Hooks's Thursday golf games, through 2 buried historic designation applications with the same firm's fingerprints on both denials, and finished by calling Marion Osa up to read into the record the single suppressed newspaper paragraph from 80 years before about a training exercise malfunction that had somehow required a permanent guard detail, and a security classification that outlived the war it was supposedly connected to by 8 decades. Then she called Nash. He hadn't planned much of what he said. He'd meant to, driving in that morning in the clean shirt Gus had ironed, running through careful lawyer-approved language about property rights and historic preservation and due process, and all of it went out of his head the moment he stood at the little podium and looked out over a room full of faces he'd grown up around, half of them squinting at him like they were trying to decide whether the rumors flying around town since sunup were closer to true or closer to nonsense. My great-grandfather guarded that hangar during the war, he said instead, plain, the way he'd have explained a repair to a customer standing in his shop. Whatever happened out there, the Army buried it, and it stayed buried 3 generations, and I didn't go looking for any of this. I bought a condemned building for $10 because I needed the scrap money, same as anybody in this room would have done in my position. What I found instead was a family promise nobody left me instructions for, and a man with more money than sense trying 6 different ways in 9 days to either buy it, steal it, or bury it under a demolition order before anybody could ask too many questions about why he wanted it so bad. He paused, found Priscilla's steady eyes in the front row, and went on. I'm not asking this board to take my word for any of that. I'm asking you to look at what's already in the record, a waived affidavit that never should have been waived, 2 designation applications that died quiet both times the same firm showed interest in that parcel, and 80 years of nobody in county government ever once explaining on paper why Draper Field's never been sold no matter how much money got offered for it. Somebody already decided a long time ago that hangar was worth protecting. I'm just the fool who finally found out why. The room stayed quiet a long moment after he sat back down, the particular held quiet of a small town realizing, altogether, that a story it had shrugged off for decades might not have been just a story after all. Tremaine did not attend the hearing himself. His lawyer did, a sharp young man from the city who tried, gamely and without much conviction, to argue that his client's business dealings with Draper Field had been strictly commercial and entirely above board, and that the structural safety complaint stood on its own merits regardless of who had filed it or how. The board chairwoman, a heavy-set no-nonsense woman named Ruth Delgado who had sat on that board for 11 years and clearly did not care for being played for a fool, cut him off inside 4 minutes and asked, flatly, whether his client's firm could produce a single structural engineer's report supporting the complaint's claims, filed through the ordinary process rather than waved around it. The lawyer could not. The vote, when it came, wasn't close. The board granted the emergency historic designation renewal, voided the demolition order in full, and referred Assistant Commissioner Hooks's conduct to the State Ethics Office for formal review. And the room broke into the particular loud, relieved murmur of a small town that had just watched something get decided in its favor for once, against money and pull, and a man from the city who'd assumed both would be enough. Marion Ose found Nash outside afterward, standing in the parking lot with Gus while half the county filtered past offering handshakes and questions he wasn't ready to answer yet. "You know this doesn't end it," she said. "Designation protects the building. It doesn't stop a man like Tremaine from trying some other angle down the road, once the dust settles and people stop paying attention." "I know," Nash said. "You don't sound worried." He thought about the shape kneeling before him on the hangar floor the night before, light gathered warm and steady through its dark surface, the pressure of a vow finally spoken out loud after 80 years of silence. "I've got better backup than a county board now," he said, and didn't explain further, and Marion, God bless her, didn't push. A reporter from the city paper drove out to the shop 3 days after the hearing, a young woman named Dana Ferris, who covered county government the way most reporters her age covered it, hungry for anything with a whiff of scandal, and Hooks's resignation had given her plenty to chew on already. She wanted more, though. She wanted the story underneath the story, the thing half the town was already whispering about in low voices at the diner counter, and she sat across from Nash in the shop's cramped little office with a notepad open, and a patience that told him she wasn't leaving without something usable. "Off the record," she said, "what actually happened out there the night those 4 men ran off without their tools? Because I've talked to 2 of them. Neither one wants to go on record, but neither one's story matches yours from the hearing transcript either, and both of them used the word thing, unprompted, more than once." Nash had thought about this moment plenty, driving out to Draper Field and back across the last 3 weeks, turning over in his head what he'd say if somebody eventually pushed hard enough to ask him directly. He'd decided, somewhere around the 2nd or 3rd turning over, that the safest lie was the one built closest to true. "There's an old security system out there," he said, level, unhurried, the same tone he used explaining a repair estimate to a customer who didn't want to hear the number. "Wartime installation, classified back when classified still meant something, and whatever they built into that hangar back in '43 still works well enough to scare grown men half to death when they go poking at it with cutting torches in the dark. I don't fully understand it myself. County doesn't either, which is half of why they finally agreed to protect the site properly instead of pretending it was just an old barn somebody forgot about. That's a hell of a security system." "That's Draper's luck," Nash said, and let the old shrug he'd grown up hearing do some of the work for him. "Been scaring people off that parcel for 80 years. I just happened to be the first one it decided not to scare. Dana Ferris studied him a long moment, pen still, the particular narrow look of a reporter deciding whether a source was lying to her outright or simply declining to hand her the whole truth. In the end, she wrote her piece the way most of the county papers' pieces got written, colorful, a little tongue-in-cheek, calling Nash the luckiest unlucky man in 3 counties, and leaning hard into the historic mystery angle without ever quite committing to anything supernatural in print, because a serious paper couldn't run that story straight-faced no matter how many unnamed sources used the word thing. It ran on page 3, above the fold, with a photograph of Nash standing in front of the hangar's east door looking exactly as uncomfortable as he'd felt having his picture taken, and it did more to settle the county's curiosity than the hearing itself had managed, because a slightly silly story about an old wartime alarm system was, Nash came to understand, a great deal easier for people to fold neatly into their lives than the truth would ever have been. He kept the clipping. It went into the same drawer as the notebooks and Agent Ray's plain white card, evidence of the particular shape a secret took once it had survived its first real brush with daylight and come through the other side mostly intact. The trouble came back 11 days later, and it did not arrive wearing an expensive suit. Nash was under a transmission at the shop, Petey handing him tools by feel the way they'd worked together for 6 years, when a plain gray sedan pulled into the lot, government plates, the kind that told you nothing at all on purpose, and 2 people got out who didn't move like Tremin's crew had moved. No hurry, no greed showing anywhere on their faces. Just a calm, unbothered competence that Nash found, once he was standing across the counter from them, considerably more unsettling than anything Tremin had ever managed. The woman who did the talking introduced herself as Agent Ray's and did not offer a last-name-only card the way Tremin had, produced instead a federal badge Nash had no way to verify and no reason, given the circumstances, to assume was fake. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "we're aware of the recent county hearing regarding your property at Draper Field. We're also aware of an incident there in 1943 that was never properly closed out by the agency responsible at the time. We'd like to discuss transferring custodial oversight of the site to federal jurisdiction. There would be compensation, substantial compensation." "I've heard that offer before," Nash said. "Different company." "Same answer." Ray's didn't push the way Tremin had, didn't threaten or bluster, just studied him a long moment with an expression that told Nash she'd read every word of the county hearing transcript and had come prepared for exactly this response. "This isn't Mr. Tremin's operation, Mr. Calloway. His employer contracted private recovery under the assumption that a quiet civilian transfer would draw less attention than a federal one. That assumption failed rather spectacularly, given the newspaper coverage. I'm not here to steal anything or bury anything. I'm here because a security incident from 80 years ago never got formally resolved, and my office has an interest in resolving it properly, on the record, with full cooperation from the property owner rather than around him. And if I say no to transfer, then we document the site's continued status as private property under active historic designation. We close our file, and we go home." She said it plain, without any of the coiled hunger Nash had watched cross Tremin's face in that same parking lot 2 weeks before. "I'll be honest with you, since I don't think there's much point being otherwise at this stage. My office ran an assessment on your guardian construct 3 days ago, remotely, using equipment your Mr. Tremin's people left behind when they fled the property. The readings were unusual. Whatever's out there has been stable and self-contained for 80 years without a single containment breach, without a single casualty beyond the ones your own file, already documents from people who tried to force their way past it. That's not a threat profile my office has any real appetite for disturbing. We're not interested in poking a bear that's kept itself fed and quiet for 8 decades without anyone's help. We're interested in making sure nobody else pokes it either." Nash studied her a long moment, weighing the flat, careful honesty in her voice against everything Tremaine had taught him about men who wanted something badly enough to lie about wanting it. What do you actually want, then? An understanding. You keep the site private, protected, and quiet. We stay out of it, officially and unofficially, and we make sure nobody else with deeper pockets than Mr. Tremaine gets any bright ideas about trying where he failed. In exchange, if something out there ever does become unstable, if that containment your file mentions ever does fail for real, not just theoretically, you call the number on this card before you call anyone else, and we come handle it the way it should have been handled the first time, quietly, professionally, without another 80 years of cover story required. She set a plain card on the counter, no seal, no markings beyond a phone number, and left without asking for an answer on the spot, which Nash found, turning it over in his fingers after the sedan pulled out of the lot, more convincing than any hard sell could have been. He drove out to Draper Field that evening and told the warden all of it, the offer and the threat wrapped inside each other the way government offers tended to be, and felt the construct's attention settle over the account with something closer to weary recognition than alarm. This had happened before, he understood from the shape of what came back to him. Not this exact conversation, not this exact agency, but some version of it, some careful bureaucratic feeler sent out across the decades whenever the story of Draper Field threatened to surface too far into daylight. The warden had outlasted every one of them. It would, its patient, unhurried certainty told him without words, outlast this one too. Watch, it told him, do not trust, do not refuse outright either. A door left slightly open costs less than a door slammed shut, in the face of something patient enough to try again in another 80 years. Nash kept the card. He never called the number, not in all the months that followed, but he kept it in the same drawer where he'd started keeping his great-grandfather's notebook, because the warden's lesson about patient things trying again in another 80 years struck him as worth remembering even after the immediate danger had clearly passed. He asked the warden that same evening whether Agent Reyes's careful assessment equipment had actually seen anything worth being scared of, and the answer that came back was neither reassuring nor alarming so much as simply honest, the way most of what passed between them had learned, over their short weeks together, to be. It had let the equipment see exactly as much as it chose to let anything see: a stable structure, a contained cargo, nothing actively dangerous within the narrow terms the equipment had been built to measure. What it had not let the equipment see, and would not let any equipment see, human or otherwise, for as long as it had any say in the matter, was the deep hold itself, banked low and dreaming, because some things were not made safer by being measured, only by being left quiet and trusted to the keeper who already knew how to leave them that way. That's a fine line to walk, Nash said. Federal government deciding whether to trust a fine line. It has walked finer lines longer than your government has existed, the warden told him, without any particular pride in the observation, only the flat, patient certainty of something that had simply outlasted enough governments to stop being impressed by any one of them in particular. Reyes's people will watch from a comfortable distance, satisfied that watching is enough, until the day comes that it no longer is. That day is not today. It may not come in your lifetime at all. I have learned across a great many lifetimes not to spend today's peace worrying too hard over a day that has not yet arrived. Nash thought that was, on the whole, about as sound a piece of advice as anybody had ever given him, ancient alien guardian or otherwise, and he did his best, in the months that followed, to actually live by it. Reyes's office was, as far as anyone could tell, as good as her word. No second van came in the dark. No more anonymous complaints landed on the county clerk's desk. Wallace Tremin's firm dissolved quietly 8 months later, amid a fraud investigation that Priscilla Van assured Nash had nothing whatsoever to do with anything they'd done, and everything to do with the man's own long history of cutting corners on other deals entirely unrelated to Draper Field. Though she said it with a small, satisfied smile that suggested she'd made a phone call or two of her own to make certain the right people started looking closely at Wallace Treming's business practices in general. Once his name showed up in a county hearing transcript that a few motivated reporters had found considerably more interesting than the original story. Assistant Commissioner Hooks resigned before the State Ethics Review finished its work, which everyone in 3 towns agreed was the same as an admission without anyone needing to say so out loud. Draper's luck. The county started calling it again by autumn, except the shrug that had always come with the phrase had softened over the months into something closer to a nod. The story people told now less about a cursed old airstrip and more about a stubborn Callaway boy who'd held onto something the whole county turned out to be quietly proud of, without ever quite agreeing on what exactly that something was. By the time the first hard frost came to the high desert, Nash had worked out a routine he never could have predicted for himself the morning he raised his hand at Purnell's auction and said $10 like it was nothing to lose. Mornings still belonged to the shop. He opened at 7 the same as his father always had, worked the counter and the bays with Petey, who had stopped asking questions about the woman Nash was supposedly seeing once it became clear there wasn't going to be one, and who had, without either of them ever quite deciding it out loud, become the kind of hand a man could trust with more than sweeping floors. Afternoons, 3 days a week, Nash drove out to Draper Field. The State Historical Office had come through in the end with something Priscilla Van called a custodial preservation stipend, modest but steady, paid quarterly for the ordinary work of maintaining a designated historic site, mowing the scrub back from the fence line, logging the weather damage, filing the reports nobody in the regional office ever read closely enough to ask the kind of questions Nash wasn't ready to answer. It wasn't the $200,000 Treming had once dangled in front of him, wasn't even close, but it was honest money for honest work, and stacked against what the shop already brought in. It was enough, finally, to make the note on the bank letter shrink a little every month instead of grow, and Nash found he didn't miss the version of himself who might have taken Treming's offer instead. That man would have owned a great deal more money and a great deal less of everything else. The warden had grown, over those months, into something less like a mystery he was still working up the nerve to face, and more like the oldest, steadiest kind of company. The kind you didn't need to fill silence around, because the silence itself had stopped meaning distance a long time before either of them noticed the change. It taught him things in the same rationed, patient way it had taught him everything else, small pieces doled out across weeks rather than a single overwhelming flood. How to read the slow shift in the hull's light that meant weather was coming hard enough to matter. How to recognize the specific low hum that meant something in the deep hold had stirred in its sleep and settled again on its own. How to stand at the sealed door and simply wait, some mornings, without needing to ask anything at all, because the waiting itself was most of what the duty had ever actually required. It showed him once late in that first autumn, a little more of what the vision had only sketched the outline of on the night they first touched palm to palm, not the cargo itself, which remained banked and covered, and the warden's careful pressure made plain, would remain that way for a good deal longer yet, if not for the whole of Nash's own lifetime. But it showed him the fleet again, clearer this time, dozens of ships moving in that same slow ritual formation through a dark thick with more stars than any desert sky had ever offered him, and let him understand, in the wordless way understanding arrived now almost effortlessly between them, that Draper Field's hull was not the only one of its kind scattered quiet across the turning world. There were others. How many, the warden did not know, or did not choose to say, some bond-severed centuries before this one crashed, guarding cargoes in places Nash would likely never see and duties kept by keepers whose names, if they had names at all anymore, had long since worn away into whatever the alien word for legend was. That's not a small thing to carry. Knowing your family's $10 hangar is one lit window in a very large dark house. Nash sat with it a long while after the vision passed, the way he'd learned to sit with most of what the warden gave him, and decided in the end that it didn't change much about what he actually had to do on any given Tuesday afternoon, which was mow the scrub back from the fence and check the weather logs and keep his word. The one true test of that autumn came on a Thursday in late October, not from Tremming, long gone and unlamented, not from Agent Ray's careful federal patience, but from 3 teenagers out of the next county over who'd heard the newly public version of the Draper's Luck story. The county fair version, the newspaper version, curiosity dressed up as legend rather than warning, and decided. The way teenagers in every generation eventually decided about every forbidden building within driving distance, that climbing the perimeter fence after dark sounded like a fine way to spend a Thursday. Nash caught them himself, headlamp sweeping the fence line on his evening check, 3 shapes frozen mid-climb in the beam like rabbits caught in a truck's high beams, and felt something in his chest that surprised him with how little anger was actually in it. Fence is electrified past this point, he lied, easy and unhurried, the same flat tone Purnell used selling condemned lots at the county auction. Counties had 3 lawsuits already this year from kids who didn't believe that the first time somebody told them. I'd hate to see you be the 4th. They went, grumbling, disappointed, entirely unharmed, back over the fence and into a pickup that peeled off down the county road a good deal faster than it had come. Nash stood at the fence a long moment after their taillights disappeared, and felt, behind him, the particular warm, settling weight of the warden's attention, approving in the wordless way it approved of most things now, and understood something about his own place in all of this that hadn't fully landed until just then. The warden had spent 80 years keeping trespassers out with broken legs and burned-out equipment, and a silence that let men terrify themselves. Nash had just done the same job with a lie about an electric fence, and a tone he'd learned selling used transmissions to men who didn't know enough to ask the right questions. Different tools, same promise. He wondered, walking back to his truck under a sky gone hard and clear and cold, whether that was the whole shape of what growing into a duty like this one actually looked like. Not becoming something as vast and patient as the thing that had trained you into it, but finding your own smaller, human-scale way of keeping the same door closed. He told Gus about it over supper 2 nights later, and his gray tuncle laughed for the first time in longer than Nash could remember, a real laugh, head thrown back, the sound of a worry finally let all the way down. Your great-granddaddy would have told them the exact same lie, Gus said, wiping his eyes. Man never once raised his voice at a soul in his whole life that I ever heard tell of, and he ran off more trespassers with a straight face than the sheriff's department managed in the same stretch of years. Guess some things do run in the blood after all, whatever else does. You think that's what it is, blood? Gus considered that a long moment, turning his fork over in his hand. I think blood's what opened the door, he said finally. I don't much think it's what's keeping you walking back through it 3 afternoons a week for a stipend that don't near cover what you could have had from Tremming. That part, I figure, is just you being exactly the kind of stubborn fool this family's always produced, 1 generation after the last. He raised his coffee mug in something that wasn't quite a toast and was close enough. Your daddy would have been proud of you, Nash. I don't say that easy, and I mean it plain. Nash didn't trust his voice enough to answer that one right away, and Gus, God bless him again, let the silence sit there comfortable between them instead of pushing. The same patient way the warden had learned to let silence sit, out at Draper Field, across 80 long years of waiting on exactly this kind of evening to finally arrive. The trouble that winter didn't come from any man at all. A hard freeze settled over the county in January, the kind that cracked water lines and split fence posts and put half the ranchers Nash knew on generator power for the better part of a week. And it was during the 3rd night of that freeze, driving out to Draper Field through a wind that cut straight through his coat like it had a personal grudge against him, that he felt it before he ever reached the fence line. A wrongness in the pressure of the air, faint but unmistakable. The same low warning hum the warden had taught him to recognize months before as the sound of something stirring in its sleep and not, this time, settling back down on its own. He found the warden already standing at the sealed door when he got inside, its light dimmer than he'd ever seen it, guttering at the edges the way a candle guttered in a draft it couldn't quite outlast, and the pressure that arrived in his chest when it turned to him carried none of its usual patient calm. The freeze had done what 80 years of desert heat alone had never managed, cracked a support strut deep in the chamber wall, a different one than the conduit he'd repaired back in the fall. Brittle old alloy finally giving way under cold. It had never been designed to survive so many decades past its maker's care, and the strain of it was bleeding power away from the containment feed faster than the warden's own reserves could compensate for on their own. Not failing, the pressure told him, urgent in a way nothing from the warden had ever been urgent before, straining, hours not days. Nash didn't waste breath asking questions. He could answer better with his hands. He drove back to the shop through the same brutal wind, loaded his father's old portable welding rig and every spare length of steel bracing he had in the yard into the truck bed, and was back at Draper Field inside 40 minutes, working by headlamp in a chamber gone cold enough that his breath fogged even with the hull's own residual warmth radiating around him. The warden holding a section of buckling support wall steady with both long, wrong-jointed hands, while Nash cut and fit and welded bracing into place around a fracture that would have meant nothing to him 9 months before and meant, that night, the difference between a promise kept and a promise broken on a technicality neither he nor his great-grandfather could ever have anticipated. It took him past 4 in the morning. His hands had gone numb twice, and he'd warmed them twice more against the hull's own light before he trusted them again with the torch. And somewhere past 3, he became distantly aware that Gus had arrived at some point without either of them noticing him come in, standing quiet at the chamber's edge with a thermos of coffee. He didn't try to hand over until the last weld had cooled, because he understood, watching, that interrupting a man mid-repair on a fracture that mattered this much wasn't a kindness even dressed up as one. The strut held. The strain eased out of the pressure in Nash's chest the same way it had the first time. All at once, a held breath finally let go, and the warden's light steadied back toward its familiar patient cyan, seam by seam, the fear bleeding out of it the way fear bleeds out of anything once the danger's actually passed rather than merely delayed. Nash sat back against the cold floor, hands raw, exhaustion sitting on him like a physical weight, and looked up at the construct standing over him in the returning light. "That's twice now," he said, voice rough with cold and fatigue both. "Twice something in here needed hands instead of whatever passes for your hands, and twice it happened to be the exact kind of work I've spent my whole life doing without ever once thinking there was a reason for it beyond keeping trucks running." He almost laughed, tired enough that the sound came out cracked. "You didn't just wait 80 years for blood, did you? You waited for somebody who could actually do the job when it mattered." The pressure that answered him was warmer than anything it had given him before, warmer even than the moment it had first knelt and spoken the words that changed what he understood himself to be. Both, it told him, the blood opened the door. The hands are why I do not regret which door it opened. Gus finally came forward with the coffee then, crouching stiff in the cold to press the thermos into Nash's raw hands, and looked up at the warden with an expression that had, somewhere over the last several months, worn all the way through fear into something closer to plain, weathered respect. The way a man respects whether he's lived alongside his whole life, dangerous and vast and utterly indifferent to him, and yet somehow, against all sense, still worth loving the land it shaped. "You know," Gus said to Nash, to the warden, to the cold, dark chamber in general, 80-some years ago, a scared kid, barely out of high school, sat with a dying stranger because there wasn't anything else decent to do, and never once in his whole life afterward got to know whether that decency meant a single thing to anybody but himself. I think about that some nights. I think Emery died never knowing his promise held. He looked up at the warden's steady light, something thick in his voice he didn't try to hide. I'd like to think he knows now. Wherever a man goes, I'd like to think somebody finally told him it held. The warden did not answer that in words, wordless or otherwise. But its light, for just a moment, brightened toward something warmer than cyan, closer to the gold of a hearth fire than anything Nash had seen from it before, and held there, steady, long enough that both men understood it as answer enough. They drove home together as the sky over the ridge went from black to the deep bruised blue that comes an hour before real dawn, Gus quiet in the passenger seat with his hat in his lap, and Nash thought, driving, about all the ways a promise could be kept across 3 generations of men who'd never fully understood what they were keeping. His great-grandfather's silent, sleepless decades. His own father, who'd worn a ring he never asked questions about and died too young himself to ever learn its weight. And now Nash, hands raw from a torch, welding fractures in a dead alien hull at 4 in the morning, because a stranger from another sky had once asked a scared young soldier for the one thing that mattered most, and never once in 80 years been given a reason to doubt he'd get it. Spring came late that year, the way it always did in the high desert, winter holding on stubborn through most of March before finally breaking all at once into a green that never lasted long enough and was somehow more precious for it. Nash marked the anniversary of the auction without meaning to. He only realized the date when Purnell himself, of all people, stopped by the shop to get his own truck's brakes done and mentioned offhand that it had been a year almost to the week since he'd sold Hangar C for the strangest $10 of his whole career running that gavel. Best deal I ever made too, apparently, Purnell said, watching Nash work the caliper loose with the particular squint of a man who'd heard 6 different versions of the Draper's Luck story over the last 12 months and had given up trying to sort out which parts were true. County's using your hangar as the centerpiece of the new historical trail brochure now. Got a whole paragraph. Didn't mention any of the parts folks actually whisper about, of course. Just called it a significant wartime installation of continued historical interest. Real dry way to describe whatever the hell actually happened out there. Dry's fine by me, Nash said and meant it. The county had learned over the year to let Draper Field be exactly as interesting as a historical marker, and a modest visitor turnout twice a month could support. And no more, the state historical office content with its quarterly reports, the local paper content with the occasional human interest piece about the stubborn Calloway family and their 80-year vigil, and nobody, as far as Nash could tell, any closer to guessing what actually stood watch out past that reinforced hangar roof than they'd been the day the county auctioned it off for scrap value and a shrug. The Historical Society held its small dedication ceremony the 2nd Saturday of April, a modest affair by any measure. A bronze plaque no bigger than a serving tray, mounted on a post at the edge of the access road, where the county's new brochure trail split off toward Draper Field, and maybe 40 people standing around it in the cool morning air listening to the society's president read 3 paragraphs of carefully dry historical language that mentioned wartime service, continued preservation, and absolutely nothing about anything that glowed. Nash stood near the front with Gus on one side of him, cane in hand now, still a little slower on his feet than he'd been the summer before, and Petey on the other, and found himself more moved by the plainness of the occasion than he'd expected to be. Marian Osai had written most of the plaque's language herself, and she found him afterward, while the crowd broke up into small knots of conversation, and somebody's grandkids chased each other around the parked trucks. Feels strange, doesn't it, she said, watching something get made official that most of these people still don't understand even a tenth of. Feels right, though, Nash said. My great-grandfather spent his whole life keeping this quiet because nobody gave him any other choice. Nice to see it get a little daylight, even the dry version. Especially the dry version, Marion said, with the small, satisfied smile of an archivist who'd spent a long career caring more about accuracy than drama. Dry keeps people from getting curious in the wrong direction. Let them think it's a well-preserved wartime curiosity with a good ghost story attached. That's a story a place can wear for another 80 years without anybody getting hurt over it. Priscilla Van came by too, driving out from her strip mall office specifically for the ceremony, which Nash hadn't expected and appreciated more than he said out loud. She shook his hand at the edge of the gathering, quick and businesslike as ever, and told him Wallace Tremin's firm had formally dissolved that same week, its assets liquidated to cover a settlement in the fraud case that had nothing to do with Draper Field on paper, and everything to do with it in every way that actually mattered. Man spent 20 years chasing something he was never going to get, she said, watching the last of the crowd drift back toward their trucks. I've represented a few people like that over the years, never once seen it end well for them. Usually don't get the satisfaction of watching it play out quite this clean, though. Feel bad for him? Not even a little. She smiled, thin and satisfied, and went to find her car. Nash stayed after most everyone else had gone, standing at the new plaque with Gus beside him, reading the dry 3 paragraphs over one more time in the quiet. It said nothing true and nothing false either, which struck him as about the best outcome a story like this one could ever have hoped for out in the open, official enough to protect the site, thin enough to protect the secret, and warm enough in its careful, understated way that a man could stand in front of it on a cool April morning and feel, for the first time, like his family's 80-year silence had finally been given somewhere honest to rest. Your daddy would have liked this part especially, Gus said, leaning on his cane, squinting at the small bronze marker like he could still hardly believe it existed. The quiet kind of recognition. Never did care much for noise, your daddy. Guess that's another thing that runs in the family. He'd started that spring, keeping his own notebook. It sat now in the same drawer as his great-grandfather's, a plain composition book he'd bought at the drugstore in town without any particular ceremony about it, and he wrote in it the same rationed, unhurried way the warden had taught him to receive everything else it offered. Not every night, not out of obligation, but when something happened worth setting down for whoever came looking. Someday, the way he'd once gone looking through a rusted metal box wedged under a buckled slab of concrete. He wrote about the strut he'd welded in the January freeze. He wrote about the 3 teenagers at the fence line, and the lie about the electric current that had sent them running without a single broken leg between them, because he'd meant, from the first night he understood what he was keeping, to do this differently than 80 years of silent broken bones had done it, gentler where gentleness would hold the line just as well as fear ever had. He wrote, on a night in early April, a single line that took him longer to compose than anything else in the whole notebook, because he wanted it exact, the way his great-grandfather had wanted his own words exact, 40 years before a stroke of bad luck at a fence line took him before he ever got to finish saying what he meant. I don't know how many more of us there'll be before whatever's sleeping in that deep hold wakes up for good, or needs to. I don't know if I'll live to see it, or if it'll be some Calloway 3 generations past me who never met me and only knows my handwriting the way I only know Emery's. But I know now what he knew sitting with a dying stranger 80 years back, that some promises aren't about what you get for keeping them. They're about who you become in the keeping. He brought Petey out to Draper Field for the first time on a Sunday afternoon in late April, 3 years to the day. As it happened, from the afternoon Petey had first started sweeping floors at Calloway's Repair as a rangy 15-year-old who didn't say much and worked harder than anybody Nash had ever hired since. He hadn't planned to bring him. It had simply reached the point, over the last several months, where lying to a young man he trusted with the shop's whole daily operation had started to sit wrong in a way it hadn't in the first frightened weeks, when the fewer people who knew, the safer everyone had seemed. Petey stood in the hangar's east doorway a long, silent moment when the hull's light rose to greet them, Cyan tracing itself seam by seam up 60 feet of alien alloy the way it had for Nash himself almost exactly a year before, and Nash watched the kid's face go through the same stages his own must have gone through. Disbelief, fear, and then, slower, the particular quiet wonder of a person realizing the impossible thing in front of him was not, in fact, going to hurt him. "This the woman you've been seeing," Petey said finally, faint and a little strangled, and Nash laughed for real, the first easy laugh he'd had out at that hangar in longer than he could place. "Something like that," he said. "You good?" Petey didn't answer right away. He was looking up at the warden, who had stepped down from the hull's flank the way it always did now for visitors it had decided, through whatever quiet channel governed such decisions, could be trusted to see it, and the construct returned the look with the same faceless, patient attention it gave everyone, tilting its head the barest fraction in the gesture Nash had long since learned to read as something close to a nod. "Yeah," Petey said at last, voice steadier. "Yeah, I think I'm good." He looked over at Nash, something working behind his eyes that Nash recognized, because he'd felt the same thing himself standing in that exact spot a year before, notebook in hand, understanding for the first time that his whole life had just quietly rearranged itself around a debt he hadn't known he was born owing. "You need help with whatever this is." "Because I've been sweeping your floors 6 years now, Nash, and I figure I've earned knowing why half our Thursday deliveries get rescheduled without explanation." Nash looked at the warden. The warden looked back, and the pressure that arrived in his chest this time was neither approval nor warning, but something closer to a question turned back on him. His choice to make, the same way every choice about this promise had from the very beginning belonged to him and no one else. "Maybe," Nash said to both of them at once, "not today. But maybe." He drove Petey home an hour later, quiet and thoughtful in the passenger seat the way Gus had been quiet the morning after the January freeze, and felt, easing his truck back onto the county road as the sun dropped low and gold over the ridge, the particular settled satisfaction of a man watching a promise he'd once carried entirely alone start, slowly and on his own terms, to become something he might not always have to carry by himself. The one hard scare of that first full year came in June, and it had nothing to do with Tremaine or federal agents or anything sleeping in a deep-holed 80 years patient. It came from Gus's own chest, on a Saturday hot enough that the shop swamp cooler had quit twice before noon, while the two of them were out at Draper Field clearing brush, the state's fire code required along the fence line before the dry season took hold in earnest. Gus went down without much warning, a grunt, a hand flying to his sternum, and then he was sitting hard in the dirt with his face gone the color of old paper, sweat standing out cold on his forehead despite the heat, and Nash was on his knees beside him before he'd fully registered moving at all. "Just need a minute," Gus said, which was exactly the kind of thing a stubborn old man said right before he very much did not just need a minute, and Nash didn't waste breath arguing with him. He had his phone out, and the ambulance called before Gus finished the sentence, and it was only once the county dispatcher had the address and the promise of a rig rolling that Nash let himself look up, past his gray uncle's gray, sweating face, toward the hangar's open door. The warden had come as far as the threshold and no further. Nash would understand only later, turning the moment over in the sterile quiet of a hospital waiting room, that it had never once in 80 years crossed that threshold uninvited, not for trespassers, not for federal agents, not even now, with a man it had watched visit Draper Field for the better part of a year folded up in the dirt clutching his own chest. It stood in the doorway, faceless and still, its light gone low and steady in a register Nash hadn't seen from it before, and the pressure that reached him across the yard between them carried nothing he could act on, no vision, no answer, only the plain, helpless shape of something ancient and vast understanding, for perhaps the first time in its whole long watch, that some kinds of trouble simply did not belong to any promise it had the power to keep. The ambulance took 11 minutes that felt like an hour, and Nash rode in behind it in his own truck with his knuckles white on the wheel, and spent the 4 hours after that pacing a linoleum hallway 2 towns over while a cardiologist he'd never met ran tests and asked questions and finally, close to sundown, came out to tell him that Gus had suffered what the man called a moderate cardiac event. Serious, survivable. The kind of warning a body sent when it wanted a man to start listening to it, and that with rest and medication and considerably less brush clearing in June heat. There was no reason at 71 he couldn't have a good many years left in him yet. Nash sat with his great uncle that night in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and bad coffee, watching a heart monitor tick its slow green line across a screen, and thought about his great-grandfather's blank pages, 40 years of a story that had simply stopped one day at a fence line with no warning at all. No hospital, no monitor, no chance for anybody to sit with him and watch the line keep ticking. Gus, awake and cranky and already complaining about the food, was not going to end up a blank page. Nash understood, sitting there in the dark, exactly how much of that difference had come down to 11 minutes and a phone call, and exactly how little any of it had to do with anything ancient or alien standing watch 4 miles down the county road. "Quit looking at me like that," Gus said, cracking one eye open sometime past midnight, catching Nash still awake in the chair beside the bed. "I'm not dying tonight. Doctor already told you that twice." "I know." "Then quit looking like you're rehearsing the sentence anyway." Gus shifted, wincing, and settled again. "I know what's chewing on you, Nash, and it isn't really me. It's that you sat out there in the dirt today and understood, maybe for the first time all the way down, that the thing you promised to keep can't actually keep you. Can't keep any of us. 80 years of watching that door and it never once, not for a second, could have done a single thing about a bad valve in an old man's heart." He said it gentle, but he said it plain, the way Gus said most things that mattered. That's not a flaw in the promise, boy. That's just what it means to love something that isn't built to protect you back. You knew that going in. Your daddy knew it running that shop into the ground rather than sell it. I knew it 4 miles down that road my whole life, same as you're learning it now. Nash didn't have an answer for that worth saying out loud at midnight in a hospital room, so he reached over instead and gripped his great-uncle's hand, the one not threaded through with an IV line, and held it there a while, and Gus let him, and neither of them said anything else until the nurse came in to check the monitor and gently shoo him back to the chair. Gus came home 8 days later with a bottle of pills and strict instructions about heat and exertion that he grumbled about following, and as far as Nash could tell over the following weeks, actually did follow, more or less. Out of some quiet private fear Nash never asked him to name out loud. Nash took over the fence line brush clearing entirely after that, alone on the hot Saturdays, and found that he didn't mind the extra work nearly as much as he minded the plain, unglamorous truth Gus had handed him from a hospital bed, that everything he'd built out at Draper Field over the last year, the whole reverent architecture of promise and bloodline and ancient patient watch, sat right alongside the same fragile, ordinary mortality that took fence-line hearts and hospital nights and gave no guardian construct any say in the matter at all. He told the warden about it 2 weeks later, once Gus was steady enough that Nash trusted himself to say the words without his voice breaking in the middle of them, and felt, in the pressure that answered him, something he hadn't expected from a thing that old, not detachment, not the patient distance he'd have guessed 80 years of watching mortal men come and go might have worn into it, but something closer to grief held very carefully. The particular ache of a keeper who had watched exactly this kind of frailty claim Emery himself decades before, and had never once, in all that time, found a way to stand between a promise and the plain fact of a human heart wearing out on its own schedule. I could not save him either, it told him, and Nash understood, hearing it, that it meant Emery as much as it meant Gus. 80 years of the same grief carried quiet and unspoken the whole time. Nash had assumed the construct simply didn't feel the weight of what it watched happen to the people it had chosen. I was never given that kind of power. Only the power to wait, and to watch, and to be here when the ones I waited for were ready to come. Maybe that's enough, Nash said, and found, saying it, that he believed it. Maybe that was always the whole point. You can't keep us safe from everything. Nobody can. You can just make sure that whatever's worth protecting doesn't get lost while we're all busy being fragile and mortal, and running out of time same as everybody else. He thought of Gus's hand in his, the green line ticking steady across a hospital monitor at midnight, his great-grandfather's blank pages, his father gone too soon, the same as Emery had gone too soon, and understood that the whole shape of what he'd inherited was not, and had never been, immunity from any of that. It was only company in the middle of it, a door that stayed open, a light that kept watch. That, it turned out, was worth a great deal more than he'd understood the morning he'd raised his hand in a gravel lot and said $10 like it cost him nothing. He asked the warden once, a few weeks after that, the question that had been sitting quiet in the back of his mind since the very first night he'd stood outside the hangar wall and watched a single seam of light stitch itself awake at chest height. The question that had shaped, without his ever quite saying it out loud, everything he'd come to understand about what he owned and what he'd inherited, and what the whole county for 80 years had gotten backward without ever knowing they had. Since the very first night he'd stood outside the hangar wall and watched a single seam of light stitch itself awake at chest height, the question that had shaped, without his ever quite saying it out loud, everything he'd come to understand about what he owned and what he'd inherited, and what the whole county for 80 years had gotten backward without ever knowing they had. They were standing together near the base of the hull, evening coming down soft and gold through the gaps in the reinforced roof, and Nash had his hand resting flat against the cold alloy the way he did most visits now, less out of any need to communicate through it, and more out of the plain human habit of resting a hand on something you'd come to think of, against every early expectation, as close to family. All those years, he said. Everybody who ever came near this place, the backhoe man, the survey crew, 3 different development outfits, Tremin's whole 20-year campaign, they all figured it was the ship. Some old alien weapon, some failsafe. Dead man's switch built into the hull. Nobody ever once thought to ask whether the ship could even still fight, because it never occurred to anybody that it might not be the ship at all standing between them and whatever's down in that deep hold. The warden's light shifted, slow, toward something Nash had learned to read as thoughtful stillness rather than simple quiet. They weren't all wrong to think that, he went on. It's a battleship, whole thing built for war once, a long time before it ever crashed here. Made sense to assume the teeth were still in it somewhere, even burned out and buried under 80 years of dust. Easier to be scared of a weapon than to imagine something like you standing guard this whole time on nothing but a promise and no working systems left to back it up. He looked up at the construct's faceless plane, steady and warm in the fading light. That's the part nobody in this whole county ever got right. It was never the hull keeping people out. Every broken leg, every ruined survey crew, every quiet refusal from a county council that could never explain itself, that was all you. Alone. The ship's been nothing but dead weight around you this whole time, and you carried the job anyway, because a scared kid in 1943 asked you to, and you never once considered it optional. The pressure that answered him arrived slower than usual, weighed and careful. The particular deliberate shape the warden gave to things it wanted him to carry away whole rather than in fragments. The ship was never what protected the promise, it told him. The ship is what I was protecting. The promise protected itself, the whole time, in the only way a promise ever can. How's that? By finding someone who would come back and keep it. Nash sat with that a long moment, hand still flat against the cold alloy, and understood, turning it over the way he'd turned over so much else across that long strange year. that the warden was telling him something true not just about 80 years of guard duty on a dead hull, but about the whole shape of what had happened to him personally since the morning he'd raised his hand in a gravel lot and said $10 like it cost him nothing. He'd come out to Draper Field expecting a stripped-down building and some scrap aluminum to save his shop. What had actually been waiting for him, patient, faceless, unkillable, and entirely dependent the whole time on nothing sturdier than a dying stranger's faith that a promise made across an impossible gap in kind would still hold, 3 generations and 80 years later, in the hands of someone who hadn't even been born yet when it was made, had never been a weapon at all. It had been something closer to hope, armored in alloy and dressed up as a guardian because hope needed some shape to survive in, out here in the dark, waiting on a debt only a stranger's descendant could ever repay. "You could have picked wrong," Nash said, quieter now. 80 years of waiting, and there wasn't any guarantee at all that whoever showed up with my blood in them would be worth a damn. Could have been somebody who took Tremin's money the first afternoon and never looked back. Could have been nobody at all, if the line had died out clean somewhere along the way. I did not wait for guarantee, the warden told him, and the warmth in that answer settled into Nash's chest the way the best truths always seem to, arriving whole and needing no argument to hold their shape. I waited for you specifically, whichever shape you would have taken when you finally came. Emery did not ask me to trust his bloodline's virtue. He asked me to trust that his bloodline would, eventually, produce someone willing to be asked. That was always the whole of the promise, not perfection. Willingness. Nash didn't have an answer for that worth saying out loud, so he didn't try to find one. He stood with his hand against the hull as the last of the gold light drained out of the gaps in the roof, and the hangar settled into the particular blue dark of a desert evening giving way to full night, the warden's own light rising gentle to fill the space the sun left behind, steady and patient, and entirely unbothered by the dark the way it had been unbothered by 80 years of it before Nash ever arrived to share the watch. He thought, standing there, of his great-grandfather's blank pages, 40 years of a notebook that never got finished, a story that died with the man who started it because nobody left came looking hard enough to carry it forward. He thought of his own notebook, sitting half-filled in a drawer at home, waiting the same patient way everything out here seemed to wait, for whichever Calloway came looking next, whenever that turned out to be, however many years stood between now and then. He wasn't finished with the promise. He understood that clearly, standing in the deepening dark with a construct that had outlived empires keeping quiet watch beside him. He might never be finished with it, not in any way a man expected to finish things in one lifetime. The deep hold would keep sleeping, or it wouldn't, and either way the work of the watch would likely outlast him the same unhurried way it had outlasted Emery, patient and total, and handed forward again down whatever thread of blood and willingness came next. But for the first time since he'd stood in that gravel lot with his hand raised, and $10 riding on a bet he hadn't understood he was making, Nash Calloway didn't feel like a man carrying a debt he'd stumbled into by accident. He felt like a man standing exactly where he was supposed to be standing, keeping exactly the kind of watch he'd turned out, against every early expectation, to be built for. The hull's light settled around him, warm and steady in the full dark, and somewhere in its vast cold heart, banked low and patient and dreaming, whatever the cartographer's fleet had died to protect went on sleeping safe, the way it had for 80 years, the way it would for however many more it took, not because a battleship's dead guns still had teeth in them, and not only because a construct built along lines no human hand had ever drawn had kept its faceless, unbroken vigil across every one of those years alone. It slept safe, because a scared young soldier had once sat with a dying stranger instead of walking away, and because, 3 generations and 80 years later, his blood had finally produced someone willing to sit down again. That was the whole of it. That was what had always stood guard over Draper Field, under the hull, under the myth, Under every wrong guess a frightened county had ever made about broken legs and ruined equipment, and a curse nobody could quite name. Not a weapon. Not even, in the end, the tireless construct that wore the name Warden the way a soldier wears a rank he never asked for. Just a promise kept, one willing hand at a time for as long as it took. Nash locked the east door behind him that night the same as always, an old habit from a man who no longer needed a lock to keep anything out, and drove home under a sky gone thick with more stars than the town ever bothered looking up to see. And somewhere behind him, patient and warm and no longer alone in its long watch, the last light of an ancient battleship that had never once been what protected anything settled low and steady in the dark. Standing guard beside the one thing in 80 years that finally deserved to be called family.